Hey my sleepy friends, I'm sure today has been quite long, so why don't we get snuggled up and let me tell you a story about the quiet history of witches, from the first trials to Salem, to travelling through centuries of shadows and firelight into the lives of people accused of impossible things. This is a story without monsters, only humans, fear, and the strange ways communities convince themselves that danger lives next door. If you're new here, joining the community is super quick and easy. Just tap subscribe and like the video and let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's a small click that makes a huge difference in helping us grow. Now find your favourite spot and let's begin. Imagine standing in a medieval village at twilight, when the sun has just dipped below the horizon and the world exists in that peculiar in-between light where shapes become uncertain. The forge fire glows orange in the blacksmith's shop, smoke rises from thatched roofs, and somewhere a dog barks at something you cannot see. This is the world where the idea of witches took root, not as a sudden invention, but as a slow accumulation of older beliefs mixing with newer fears, like sediment settling at the bottom of a river over centuries, long before anyone spoke of witches. In the way we understand them now, people believed in magic as naturally as they believed in weather. If you lived in ancient Rome or Greece, you might visit a local wise woman for a love charm, or pay someone to curse your business rival. Magic was simply another tool, morally neutral, available to anyone willing to learn the formulas and make the proper offerings to the right gods. But these were small magics, personal and local. The witch hunts that would eventually sweep across Europe and leap the Atlantic to America required something more. A complete reorganization of how people understood evil itself. Christianity brought with it a new cosmology, a universe divided between absolute good and absolute evil, with very little room for the comfortable grey areas where ancient magic had lived. The old gods and spirits who had been neutral or even helpful became, in Christian theology, demons pretending to be something else. That helpful household spirit your grandmother left bread for. Now it was a devil in disguise, trying to steal your soul. This transformation happened slowly over centuries. A monk working by candlelight in a 6th century scriptorium had different concerns than a village priest in the 12th century, who in turn understood the world differently than the inquisitors of the 15th century. Each generation added layers to the concept, like a pearl forming around a grain of sand. By the medieval period, educated theologians had begun constructing elaborate theories about how demons operated in the world. They wrote thick books debating whether demons could physically transport people through the air, whether they could take physical form, and whether contracts with the devil needed to be written in blood, or if a verbal agreement sufficed. These debates were conducted with the same seriousness that modern lawyers bring to contract law, because to these thinkers, demonic interaction was absolutely real. But here's something interesting. For most of the Middle Ages, while scholars were writing these elaborate theories, actual accusations of witchcraft were relatively rare. The church was actually more likely to prosecute people for claiming that witches existed and could harm others. The official position, recorded in a document called the Canon Episcopi, was that belief in witches flying through the night sky was foolish superstition. If you claimed your neighbour could transform into an animal and curse your cow, you might be the one in trouble for believing such nonsense. This creates a curious paradox. The intellectual framework for witch hunting was being constructed while the authorities simultaneously denied that such things were possible. It's like building a detailed blueprint for a machine while insisting the machine could never actually work. The village experience was different from the scholarly one. In small communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, where your survival might depend on your neighbours helping with the harvest or lending you seed grain during a bad year, there was always a need to explain misfortune. Why did your child die when your neighbours thrived? Why did your crops fail while hers flourished? Why did you feel a sudden pain in your leg after arguing with that old woman at the well? Every community had people on its margins. The elderly widow with no family, the strange hermit living at the forest's edge, the woman whose medicinal knowledge seemed a little too effective, and the midwife who knew too much about birth and death. These people were useful. You needed healers after all, and someone had to help birth babies and prepare the dead. But usefulness and suspicion have always been uneasy neighbours. The word witch itself comes from the Old English wix, which simply meant someone who practiced magic or divination. But language is a living thing, and as centuries passed, the word accumulated darker meanings, gathering fear the way wool gathers burrs. In many villages, there were what we might call cunning folk, people usually women, but sometimes men, who knew herbal remedies could help you find lost objects, might tell your fortune, or provided charms to protect your livestock. They operated in a strange social space, valued but feared, necessary but suspicious. You might visit one when your child has a fever, but you wouldn't necessarily want to sit next to them in church. These cunning folk had accumulated practical knowledge passed down through generations. They knew which plants eased pain, which herbs brought down fever, which fungi were poison, and which were medicine. In a world without doctors, without pharmacies, without any formal medical care, this knowledge was essential. But knowledge that seems magical when you don't understand it can easily become frightening when circumstances turn dark. The medieval world was also one of intimate familiarity with death and suffering. Childhood diseases that we now prevent with simple vaccines killed regularly. Infections from minor injuries could prove fatal. Childbirth was dangerous for both mother and baby. Crops failed. Livestock died. And because the actual causes of these tragedies were invisible, bacteria, viruses, genetic conditions, environmental factors, people needed explanations that made sense within their worldview. If your neighbour insulted you on Tuesday and your best cow died on Wednesday, the connection seemed obvious. Not because you were stupid or superstitious, but because you lived in a world where cause and effect weren't clearly understood, where coincidence and correlation were indistinguishable, and where everyone around you believed that malevolent will could produce tangible harm. Picture Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries, and you're looking at a world being fundamentally remade by forces that seemed, to the people living through them, like the end times themselves. The Black Death arrived in 1347 and killed somewhere between a third and half of Europe's entire population over the next few years. Imagine watching half the people in your town die in a matter of months, their bodies covered in black swellings, coughing blood, delirious with fever. Imagine the smell of mass graves, the silence where children's voices used to be, and the empty houses with doors standing open because no one was left to close them. Survivors emerged into a transformed world. Labour was suddenly scarce and valuable. The old social order, where peasants knew their place and noblemen knew theirs, began to crack. The church, which had promised protection and salvation, had proved unable to stop the dying. Everyone wanted explanations, and disease caused by bacteria spread by fleas on rats wasn't available as an answer. Into this traumatized, destabilized world came a rising anxiety about heresy and spiritual corruption. The church was fighting battles on multiple fronts, against Muslim expansion in the east, against internal reform movements that questioned papal authority, and against the lingering presence of non-Christian traditions in rural areas that had been nominally converted centuries earlier but still practiced old rituals under a thin veneer of Christianity. The Spanish Reconquista had created anxiety about religious and cultural purity. The Cathars had been brutally suppressed. The Waldensians were being hunted. Jewish communities faced increasing persecution. Europe was becoming obsessed with finding and eliminating religious contamination, like someone with severe anxiety constantly checking for dirt that might not actually be there. The printing press arrived in the mid-15th century, and suddenly, ideas could spread faster than ever before. This wasn't just good news. It also meant that fears, accusations, and theories about evil could circulate and reinforce themselves across vast distances. A wild accusation in one region could be printed, distributed, and inspire similar accusations hundreds of miles away. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issued a papal bull acknowledging the existence of witches and authorizing inquisitors to prosecute them. This was a significant shift from earlier church positions. The official stance had moved from believing in witches is superstitious nonsense to witches are real and must be destroyed. Two Dominican inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, took this authorization and ran with it. In 1487 they published the Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, which would become the most influential guide to witch hunting ever written. It was essentially an instruction manual for identifying, interrogating and prosecuting witches, complete with theological justification and practical advice. The Malleus is a deeply strange document if you read it today. It contains elaborate arguments about why women are more susceptible to demonic corruption than men. Spoiler, the authors believed women were intellectually and morally weaker. It describes in detail how to conduct interrogations and torture sessions. It explains what questions to ask, how to interpret answers, and why denials of guilt should be treated as confirmations of guilt. One particularly dark innovation in the Malleus was its approach to evidence. Traditional legal systems required clear proof of harm, but witch hunters argued that witchcraft was a secret crime that left no visible evidence. Therefore, rumour, reputation, and spectral evidence, claims that the accused person's spirit or demon had appeared to the accuser, could be acceptable in court. This essentially meant that accusations themselves became evidence, creating a system where defending yourself was nearly impossible. The book was reprinted dozens of times and became standard reading for judges and inquisitors across Europe. It's darkly ironic that one of the first bestsellers created by printing press technology was an instruction manual for persecution, but we should be careful not to imagine this as solely a top-down phenomenon with authorities forcing witch trials on reluctant populations. The reality was more complex and more disturbing. Communities often initiated accusations themselves, bringing suspects to authorities and demanding action. The witch hunts worked because they tapped into existing tensions, fears, and conflicts within communities. Economic anxiety played a role. As medieval economies began transforming into early capitalism, traditional social safety nets were fraying. The woman begging at your door, whom you turned away because you had little yourself, might later be accused of cursing you out of revenge. Guilt, fear, and self-justification could blend into accusations that protected you from having to examine your own moral choices. Religious anxiety also intensified during the Reformation. As Christianity fractured into competing versions of truth, everyone became more concerned about spiritual contamination. Catholics accused Protestants of being in league with the devil. Protestants returned the favour. Communities that had lived with religious ambiguity for centuries suddenly demanded clarity and purity, and anyone who didn't fit the approved model became suspect. The Little Ice Age, a period of cooling temperatures that began in the 14th century and lasted into the 19th, contributed to agricultural failures, famines, and social stress. When your crops failed year after year, when summer never quite arrived, and when winter seemed endless, it was easy to believe that someone had cursed the weather itself. Climate change has always created scapegoats. The earliest organised witch trials began in the Alps, in the border regions between Switzerland, France and Italy, in the early 15th century. These mountainous areas, where small communities lived in relative isolation, became laboratories for developing witch-hunting practices that would later spread across Europe. The trials in Valais, Switzerland, in the 1420s and 1430s, established patterns that would be repeated for centuries. Accusations typically started with someone explaining their misfortune, illness, death, or crop failure, by pointing to a recent interaction with a suspect neighbour. Under interrogation, which often included torture, the accused might confess to meeting with the devil, flying through the night sky to secret gatherings, or causing harm through supernatural means. Here's where these early trials developed something particularly insidious. Once you confessed to being a witch, you were expected to name other witches who had attended these secret meetings. This created a cascade effect, where one accusation could bloom into dozens. Torture made people say whatever they thought might stop the pain, including implicating friends, neighbours, and family members. It was a system that fed on itself, growing larger with each new name extracted from a person in agony. The accused in these early trials were predominantly older women, often widows, usually poor, but not always. Sometimes the accusations reached people with property, with status, and with connections. This created a strange dynamic. Witch hunting could destabilize social hierarchies, allowing the powerless to strike at the powerful through accusation, but it also reinforced existing power structures by primarily targeting the most vulnerable. Imagine being a woman in your 60s, widowed, living alone in a small cottage at the edge of a village. You've survived plague, famine, and the deaths of most people you loved. You know herbs and healing because you've had to. When you walk through the village, younger people sometimes cross themselves. Children dare each other to knock on your door. One day, a neighbour's child falls ill. The neighbour remembers that you muttered something when she refused to sell you eggs last week. She tells her husband. He tells the village elder. Someone mentions that another child died 3 years ago after your shadow supposedly fell across their doorway. Others remember unexplained accidents, mysterious illnesses, and strange sounds in the night. Before you quite understand what's happening, you're being dragged before a magistrate. People you've known your entire life testify against you. Their faces a mixture of fear and what looks almost like relief. They're afraid of you, yes, but perhaps also afraid of their own doubts, their own uncharitable thoughts. and their own failures to embody Christian love. Projecting evil onto you makes their own compromises more bearable. The interrogation begins gently. You're asked simple questions. Do you attend church regularly? Do you know the Lord's Prayer? Have you ever been angry with your neighbours? Have you ever wished harm on anyone? These seem like reasonable questions until you realise that everyone has been angry. Everyone has wished harm. And admitting these universal human feelings becomes evidence of demonic inclination. You try to defend yourself, but your very defensiveness is taken as proof of guilt. Wouldn't an innocent person accept God's judgment without protest? If you continue to protest your innocence, torture might be applied, not out of cruelty, the authorities would insist, but out of necessity. Your body is already corrupted by the devil, they believe, so pain applied to it is medicinal, designed to force out the truth that the devil has hidden. The logic is circular and perfect. Resistance proves guilt, confession proves guilt, and there's no path that leads to innocence once the process begins. In Trier, Germany, between 1581 and 1593, witch trials resulted in the execution of around 368 people. The Prince Archbishop who authorised these trials was himself later accused of being too lenient on witches. This is the Alice in Wonderland logic of witch hunting. Moderation becomes suspicious, mercy becomes evidence of conspiracy, and the only way to prove you're not sympathetic to witches is to find and burn more of them. In Bamberg, Germany, between Distossas, 1626 and 1631, perhaps 600 people were executed as witches. The witch hunting became so extensive that special buildings were constructed to handle the volume of interrogations and executions. The Drudenhaus, witch house, in Bamberg was essentially a torture factory, processing accusations with bureaucratic efficiency. But not everywhere succumbed to this panic. Some regions remained relatively untouched by witch trials. Some magistrates simply refused to prosecute. Some communities resisted the pressure to identify witches among their neighbours. This variability is important to remember. Witch hunting wasn't an inevitable feature of the period, but a specific phenomenon that required particular conditions to flourish. Where witch hunting took hold, it often followed patterns of social stress. A bad harvest, an outbreak of disease, a military threat, economic disruption. These created anxiety that sought an outlet in accusation, communities that maintained stronger social bonds, better conflict resolution mechanisms, or more sceptical authorities often avoided the worst excesses. The executions themselves varied. In some regions, convicted witches were strangled before being burned, which was considered merciful. In others, they were burned alive. Some were hanged, some were drowned. The methods reflected local custom and the severity of the supposed crime. Those who confessed and repented might receive quicker deaths. Those who maintained their innocence to the end were often subjected to the harshest punishments. What's haunting about reading trial records is how ordinary everything seems. The scribe carefully records the date, the accused's name, and the charges. Witnesses testify in matter-of-fact tones about supernatural events. Yes, the accused appeared in my bedroom as a spirit. Yes, I saw her flying. Yes, she caused my cow's milk to dry up. The supernatural was treated as simply another category of evidence, like eyewitness testimony in a theft case. You might think that the Renaissance, with its revival of classical learning, its emphasis on humanism, and its scientific curiosity would have ended witch hunting. Instead, the 16th and 17th centuries saw witch trials intensify and spread. The same intellectual ferment that produced great art and early science also produced increasingly elaborate theories about demonic intervention. This period saw some of the most educated minds in Europe writing extensively about witchcraft. King James VI of Scotland, later James III of England, wrote Demonology, a philosophical exploration of witchcraft that treated demonic intervention as a subject worthy of royal scholarly attention. Jean Bodin, one of France's great legal theorists and political philosophers, wrote De la démonomanie des sorciers, arguing that witchcraft prosecutions should be more severe, and that judicial mercy toward accused witches was itself a form of heresy. These weren't ignorant peasants spreading superstition. These were the intellectual elite of their age, applying the full force of their learning to the question of how demons operated in the world. It's a reminder that intelligence and education don't automatically protect against systematic errors in thinking, especially when those errors are embedded in your culture's fundamental assumptions about reality. The Renaissance also saw the witch. Hunts spread northward into Scandinavia and eastward into Poland and Russia. Each region adapted witch hunting to its own cultural context. In Scandinavia, accusations often involved harmful magic against ships and sailors, unsurprising in seafaring cultures where storms at sea could mean death and financial ruin. In Eastern Europe, beliefs in vampires and werewolves sometimes merge with witchcraft accusations, creating local variations on the theme of malevolent supernatural power. England developed its own distinctive approach to witch hunting. English law didn't allow torture except in cases of treason, which meant that confessions had to be obtained through other means: lengthy interrogations, sleep deprivation, isolation, and psychological pressure. The accusations in England also tended to focus more on maleficium, actual harmful magic, rather than the elaborate sabbaths and demon worship that dominated continental trials. The most famous English witch hunter was Matthew Hopkins, who operated during the English Civil War in the 1640s. He called himself the Witchfinder General, though no one had actually appointed him to any such position, and travelled through East Anglia finding witches with disturbing efficiency. His methods were technically legal, no torture officially, but involved tactics like forced walking, keeping suspects awake and moving for days until they became delirious, pricking, searching for spots on the body that didn't bleed or feel pain, supposedly marks made by the devil, and the swimming test, binding suspects and throwing them in water to see if they floated, which would prove guilt, or sank, which would prove innocence but might also result in drowning. Hopkins operated for only about 2 years, but in that time was responsible for perhaps 300 executions. What's particularly notable about his career is how it illustrates the entrepreneurial aspect of witch hunting. Hopkins charged fees to towns for his services, creating a financial incentive to find witches. This economic dimension of witch hunting is often overlooked. Fear was genuine, but it also became a business. Meanwhile, in Scotland, witch trials took on particular intensity. Scottish law allowed torture, and Scottish Presbyterianism's emphasis on rooting out sin created an environment where witch hunting flourished. Between 1563 and 1736, somewhere between 2,500 and 4,000 people were executed as witches in Scotland, an extraordinarily high number for a relatively small population. The North Berwick witch trials of 1590-91, involving accusations that a coven of witches had tried to murder King James VI by raising storms at sea, show how witch trials could become entangled with politics. The accused included both peasants and members of the nobility. Confessions extracted under torture described elaborate rituals and plots that conveniently implicated the king's political enemies. Whether the king genuinely believed in the supernatural threat or cynically used witch accusations to eliminate opposition, the result was the same: executions that reinforced royal power while purging potential threats. But amid all this persecution, sceptical voices were emerging. Reginald Scott's The Discovery of Witchcraft, published in 1584, systematically argued against the reality of witchcraft, suggesting that supposed witches were either victims of delusion, mental illness, or malicious accusation. King James was so offended by Scott's book that he ordered copies burned, but the book survived, and its arguments would eventually contribute to the decline of witch hunting. In the Holy Roman Empire, where the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, was tearing the region apart along religious lines, witch hunting reached some of its most extreme manifestations. In Würzburg, Prince Bishop Philipp Adolf von Ehrenberg presided over trials that executed around 900 people between 1626 and 1631. The victims included children as young as 7, members of the nobility, and eventually people so clearly innocent by any rational standard that the trial's absurdity became undeniable even to contemporaries. The Würzburg trials included the creation of detailed records, including a chilling document listing children aged 4 to 14 who were accused of having intercourse with demons. Reading such records centuries later produces a kind of vertigo. These were real children whose names were carefully recorded, who were tortured and killed based on accusations that couldn't possibly have been true. What makes the Renaissance witch hunts particularly tragic is that they occurred during a period of genuine intellectual advancement. The same century that saw the publication of the Malleus Maleficarum also saw Columbus reaching the Americas. The same period that saw thousands burned as witches also saw the development of movable type printing, advances in medicine, and the beginning of modern astronomy. Humanity's capacity for both brilliance and barbarity has never been more evident than in these contradictions. Now we cross the Atlantic to a small coastal settlement in Massachusetts, where, in 1692, some of the most famous witch trials in history would unfold in a community that had fled Europe partly to escape religious persecution, only to recreate it in new and devastating forms. Salem Village in the late 17th century was not a happy place. It was a frontier community living in the shadow of ongoing conflicts with Native Americans. King William's War had brought violence close to home, with raids and captivity narratives creating constant anxiety. The village was also experiencing internal tensions, disputes over land, arguments about the local minister's salary, factional conflicts between farming families and merchant families, and a general sense that the younger generation was abandoning the purity of their parents' faith. Into this tense environment came a peculiar episode in the household of Reverend Samuel Parris. In January 1692, his 9-year-old daughter Betty and 11-year-old niece Abigail began having strange fits, screaming, throwing objects, contorting their bodies, and speaking nonsense. A local doctor, unable to find physical causes, suggested they might be bewitched, an explanation that made sense within the worldview of Puritan Massachusetts, where Satan was seen as constantly working to corrupt God's chosen people. The girls, when pressed to name their tormentors, eventually accused 3 women: Tituba, an enslaved woman in the Parris household, Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who rarely attended church. These first 3 accused fit the traditional profile of suspected witches: marginal, vulnerable, and easy to believe ill of. What happened next transformed a local episode into a colony-wide crisis. Under interrogation, Tituba, perhaps hoping to avoid the worst punishment, perhaps pressured by her enslaver, perhaps caught up in the theological expectations of her interrogators, confessed not just to practicing witchcraft but to participating in a conspiracy of witches operating throughout Massachusetts. She described meetings with the devil, signing a book, and the involvement of other women she couldn't quite name or describe. This confession, instead of ending the episode, expanded it. If Tituba was telling the truth, then witchcraft was a real and immediate threat. If there was a conspiracy, then more witches must be identified. The girls continued having fits, and began making additional accusations. Other young women and girls in the community began having similar symptoms. It was like a stone thrown into still water, creating ripples that spread outward until they reached far beyond Salem Village. As accusations multiplied, the profile of the accused changed. The first victims had been marginal figures, but soon accusations were reaching respectable church members, property owners, and even a former minister. Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old woman known for her piety, was accused and eventually hanged despite strong community support and an initial jury acquittal that was overturned when the girls had fresh fits in the courtroom. These Salem trials proceeded in a legal environment that would seem surreal by modern standards. Spectral evidence, testimony that the accused spectre or spirit had appeared to the witness, was accepted as valid. This created an impossible situation. How do you defend yourself against claims that your spirit was doing things you weren't aware of? The legal system essentially prosecuted people for their presumed supernatural actions rather than anything they had actually done. Giles Corey, an 80-year-old farmer who refused to enter a plea to the charges against him, was subjected to pressing, heavy stones placed on his chest until he either agreed to plead or died. According to legend, his only words during 2 days of this torture were, "more weight." He died without pleading, which under English law meant his property couldn't be confiscated and would pass to his heirs. His death, meant to compel testimony, instead became a silent protest against the proceedings. By the summer of 1692, Salem's jails were overflowing with accused witches. Women who were pregnant were spared execution until after giving birth, creating the grim spectacle of women giving birth in chains, knowing they would be hanged once recovered. Children as young as 4 were accused and imprisoned. One of the accused, Sarah Good, was hanged, while her infant daughter, born in prison, died shortly after. Sarah Good's final words from the gallows, addressed to the minister urging her to confess, were reported as, "You're a liar. I am no more a witch than you are a wizard, and if you take away my life, God will give you blood to drink." By September, however, the accusations had reached so far up the social hierarchy that they were becoming untenable. When the girls accused the wife of Governor Phipps, when respected ministers began questioning the proceedings, and when juries started refusing to convict despite spectral evidence, the machinery of prosecution began to slow. The crucial shift came when prominent ministers, led by Increase Mather, argued that spectral evidence shouldn't be allowed in court. His statement, "It were better that 10 suspected witches should escape than that one innocent person should be condemned," represented a dramatic reversal of the logic that had driven the trials. Without spectral evidence, most cases collapsed. By October 1692, Governor Phipps dissolved the special court that had been handling witchcraft cases. Remaining prisoners were gradually released, many after posting bond. Of those who had been executed, 19 hanged, 1 pressed to death, none would receive official pardons for centuries. The community, having looked into an abyss of its own making, collectively decided to stop looking and move on. What's particularly haunting about Salem is how quickly the episode ended once authorities decided it should end. The same community that had been gripped by witch-hunting fever in summer was releasing prisoners by fall. This rapid reversal suggests that the trials had never been inevitable, that different choices by authorities could have prevented most or all of the deaths. The 20 people who died did so not because witchcraft belief made their deaths unavoidable, but because specific individuals in positions of authority made specific decisions to allow the prosecutions to proceed. The aftermath saw a slow, incomplete process of acknowledgement. Some of the accusers later apologised. Anne Putnam, one of the main accusers, eventually made a public apology in church, blaming Satan for deluding her. Samuel Sewell, one of the judges, publicly confessed error. But these apologies couldn't restore the dead or heal the community's wounds. Salem spent generations living with the knowledge of what it had done. By the early 18th century, witch trials were becoming increasingly rare across Europe and the colonies. This decline wasn't the result of a single cause, but rather a convergence of factors: intellectual shifts, legal reforms, religious changes, and perhaps simply exhaustion with decades of persecution. The scientific revolution was transforming how educated Europeans understood causation. When you can see microorganisms through a microscope, when you understand that disease is caused by infection rather than malevolent will, and when you can predict planetary motion through mathematics, the supernatural explanation for misfortune becomes less necessary. Not everyone accepted these new ideas immediately, but they were available as alternative frameworks for understanding the world. The Enlightenment brought increased skepticism toward traditional authorities and supernatural claims. Philosophers like Voltaire openly mocked witch trials as superstitious barbarism. This mockery created social pressure on authorities who continued prosecuting witches. They risked being seen as backward and credulous by the intellectual fashions of their time. Legal reforms also played a role. New evidentiary standards made it harder to obtain convictions based solely on confessional reputation. The use of torture in judicial proceedings gradually declined across Europe, partly from humanitarian concerns but also from growing recognition that torture produced unreliable evidence. When authorities couldn't extract confessions through pain, witch prosecutions became much harder to pursue. Religious changes mattered too, as Protestant and Catholic churches settled into coexistence after the devastating religious wars of the 16th and 17th centuries. The intense focus on spiritual purity that had fueled witch hunting began to ease. Communities that had spent generations fighting over correct doctrine were exhausted by conflict, and more interested in stability than in rooting out hidden evil. Economic development created new social structures that reduced the importance of tight-knit village communities where witch accusations had flourished. As people moved to cities, as markets expanded, and as individuals became less dependent on immediate neighbours for survival, the social conditions that had made witch accusations useful for managing interpersonal conflict began to dissolve. The last, execution for witchcraft in England, occurred in 1684. Scotland's last execution was in 1727. In France, the last execution was in 1745. The Holy Roman Empire ended witch trials in 1775. These dates mark not sudden transformations but gradual recognition that witch prosecutions no longer made sense within changing legal, intellectual and social frameworks. Poland's last witch trial occurred in 1793, notably late compared to Western Europe. This timing reminds us that change happened unevenly across the continent, reflecting different social and political conditions. Remote or conservative regions maintained beliefs that urban centres had abandoned, but the legal end of witch trials didn't mean the end of witchcraft belief. Folk beliefs about magical harm, protective charms, and supernatural causation persisted in rural areas well into the 20th century. People stopped bringing witchcraft accusations to courts, but they didn't necessarily stop believing that some neighbours had dangerous powers. The change was partly about belief, but more about what kind of claims the legal system was willing to take seriously. In some communities, informal persecution continued even after formal trials ended. Someone suspected of witchcraft might face social ostracism, property damage, or violence without any legal proceedings. These extra-legal actions were harder to track than official trials, but they represent continuity in belief even as legal structures changed. The Witchcraft Act of 1735 in Great Britain marked a significant shift in official attitudes. This law repealed previous witchcraft statutes not because it accepted that witchcraft was real, but because it made pretending to practice witchcraft or accusing others of it into a crime. The law essentially said, witchcraft doesn't exist, and claiming it does is either fraud or slander. This represented a complete reversal of earlier legal frameworks that had treated witchcraft as a real crime requiring prosecution. Yet even as educated opinion turned against witch trials, folk practices related to protection from witchcraft persisted. People continued to use horseshoes over doors, to bury objects in thresholds, and to employ counter-magic against suspected harm. The formal legal apparatus of witch hunting disappeared, but the underlying anxiety about malevolent magic took longer to fade. What finally killed witch hunting wasn't necessarily that people stopped believing in magic, but that they stopped believing. The legal system should be involved in policing it. Private beliefs about supernatural harm persisted even as public institutions refused to prosecute based on those beliefs. This separation between personal belief and official action represents a significant evolution in how modern societies handle religious and supernatural claims. The memory of the witch hunts did important cultural work in the centuries that followed. For Enlightenment thinkers, witch trials became an example of what happens when superstition and religious enthusiasm override reason. For later generations, witch hunts served as a warning about mob psychology, about the dangers of accusations that are impossible to disprove, and about how fear can transform neighbours into executioners. As you pull your blanket tighter and perhaps refill your tea, consider that the witch trials, distant as they seem, have left marks on our world that remain visible if you know where to look. The English language preserves traces of this history in phrases we use without thinking about their origins. Witch hunt has become a standard metaphor for baseless persecution, used by everyone from corporate executives defending against accusations to politicians claiming unfair treatment. The phrase captures something essential about the dynamic. Accusations that build on themselves, where defending yourself only makes you look more guilty, and where the process itself becomes punishment. Modern legal protections against certain types of prosecution developed partly in reaction to the witch trials. The principle that accusation alone isn't evidence, the right to confront your accusers, the requirement for physical proof of crime, and protections against self-incrimination. These evolved partly from recognition of how easily witch trial dynamics could produce unjust convictions. When we say innocent until proven guilty, we're embracing a standard that witch trials spectacularly violated. The trials also left their mark on how we think about women's social power. The overwhelming majority of accused witches were women, and the accusations often centred on behaviours that challenged patriarchal norms. Female independence, female knowledge, female sexuality, and female anger. The witch trials were, among other things, a mechanism for policing gender boundaries, for punishing women who didn't fit prescribed roles. This gendered aspect of witch hunting has made the witch a powerful symbol in modern feminist thought. The witch, reimagined not as an evil figure but as a woman who refused to conform and who possessed knowledge and power that threatened established structures, has become an icon of resistance. Halloween decorations featuring witches on broomsticks carry echoes of centuries of persecution, transformed into something playful but retaining a shadow of their darker origins. In Salem, the trials have become central to the town's identity in ways both thoughtful and commercial. Museums and memorial sites preserve the history while tourism capitalizes on it. Walking through modern Salem, you pass witchcraft shops selling crystals and tarot cards, next to historical markers explaining that actual witchcraft never occurred. The town wrestles with how to honour victims while acknowledging that its most famous historical episode was built on delusion and injustice. Arthur Miller's 1953 play, The Crucible, used Salem as an allegory for McCarthyist anti-communist, investigations demonstrating how witch trial dynamics could recur in modern contexts. Miller recognised that the essential pattern, accusations that are hard to disprove, social pressure to name accomplices, and personal and political motivations disguised as ideological purity wasn't limited to the 17th century. The play ensured that Salem would remain in cultural memory not just as a historical curiosity, but as a cautionary tale. Modern accusations of witchcraft still occur in some parts of the world, particularly in regions where traditional beliefs remain. Strong and legal systems are weak. In some African and Asian communities, witchcraft accusations can lead to violence, exile, or death. These contemporary witch hunts follow patterns eerily similar to European and American historical trials. Accusations against vulnerable individuals, confessions extracted through pressure or violence, and community scapegoating of marginal people. International human rights organisations now track and work to prevent witch accusations in these regions, recognising that the dynamics that produced the European witch hunts haven't disappeared. They've just moved to different cultural contexts. The underlying human tendencies that made witch hunting possible, the need to explain misfortune, the usefulness of scapegoats, the power of accusations that are difficult to disprove, remain present in human communities everywhere. Psychology has provided frameworks for understanding what happened during historical witch trials. Mass hysteria, conversion disorder, confirmation bias, the psychology of torture and confession, and group dynamics in small communities. These concepts help explain how intelligent, decent people could participate in or support witch prosecutions. Understanding these mechanisms doesn't make the history less troubling, but it does make it more comprehensible as something that emerged from ordinary human psychology under particular social conditions. The witch trials also offer insights into how societies handle invisible threats. Whether the threat is witchcraft, communism, terrorism, or viral contagion, communities face similar challenges. How to respond to genuine danger without succumbing to panic, how to protect the vulnerable while maintaining security, and how to distinguish between reasonable precaution and destructive paranoia. The witch trials represent an extreme case of getting this balance catastrophically wrong. Descendants of accused witches have worked to clear their ancestors' names, often facing bureaucratic obstacles centuries after the original accusations. In 2001, Massachusetts formally exonerated 5 women executed during the Salem trials, who had never received official pardons. In 2022, the last of the Salem witches received exoneration, 330 years after her execution. These late acknowledgements can't undo historical harm, but they represent official recognition that injustice occurred. The Wiccan religious movement, which emerged in the mid-20th century, reclaimed the word witch as a positive identity, creating a contemporary witchcraft practice that has nothing to do with demonic pacts or malevolent magic. Modern Wiccans practice what they describe as nature-based spirituality, often emphasizing healing, harmony, and connection to seasonal cycles. Whether there's any historical connection between contemporary Wicca and the practices of people accused during witch trials is debatable, but the reclamation of the term represents a fascinating cultural transformation. Academia continues studying witch trials from multiple angles, social history examining community dynamics, gender studies analysing the persecution of women, legal history tracking changes in evidentiary standards, religious history exploring theological developments, and medical history investigating possible explanations for symptoms attributed to bewitchment. Each discipline finds different aspects of the witch trials relevant to its concerns, suggesting that these events touched on fundamental aspects of human social organisation. The total number of people executed during the European and American witch trials is difficult to determine precisely. Estimates range from 40,000 to 100,000 over roughly 3 centuries, with perhaps another 100,000 to 200,000 formally accused but not executed. These numbers are horrifying, but also important to keep in perspective. Witch hunting was terrible, but it wasn't the largest source of mortality in this period. War, disease, famine, and ordinary crime killed far more people. The witch trials matter not because of their scale relative to other tragedies, but because of what they reveal about how communities can turn on their own members. Regional variations in witch hunting intensity remain puzzling to historians. Why did some areas execute thousands while neighbouring regions executed almost none? Why did witch hunting peak at different times in different places? These questions don't have simple answers. Local political situations, religious tensions, economic stress, individual authorities' attitudes, and the presence or absence of skeptical voices. All these factors interacted in complex ways that produced dramatically different outcomes in seemingly similar communities. The witch trials also demonstrate how quickly social norms can shift. Communities that executed witches one year sometimes reversed course the next, releasing prisoners and questioning what they had done. This rapid change suggests that witch hunting wasn't an inevitable expression of period belief systems, but rather a particular dynamic that required specific conditions to sustain itself. When those conditions changed, when authorities withdrew support, when skeptical voices gained influence, when communities exhausted themselves, the prosecutions could end quickly. Outside your window, the night continues its ancient routine, indifferent to human fears and accusations. The darkness that once held demons and witches now holds only the ordinary mysteries of sleeping cities and distant stars. The history of witches is, ultimately, a history of how people understand evil and suffering. When bad things happened, and bad things happened constantly in the pre-modern world, people needed explanations. The witch provided an answer that was simultaneously comforting and terrifying. Suffering had a cause, that cause was identifiable, and eliminating the cause could restore safety. But this explanation required believing that some of your neighbours were secretly working to harm you, that ordinary people could make pacts with supernatural evil, and that the appearance of normalcy could hide malevolent intent. Once you accepted these premises, the logic of witch hunting followed almost inevitably. If witches exist and can harm you, failing to identify and eliminate them becomes its own form of guilt. What we've lost in losing belief in witches as real supernatural threats is perhaps a certain sense that the universe is morally ordered in. Simple ways that bad things happen because bad people cause them, and that eliminating bad people can eliminate bad outcomes. What we've gained is the more difficult but more accurate understanding that suffering often has no villain, that random chance and impersonal forces shape our lives as much as human agency, and that sometimes there's no one to blame when tragedy strikes. The people who participated in witch trials, accusers, witnesses, judges, executioners, were not, for the most part, cruel or unusual. They were ordinary people operating within belief systems that made sense in their cultural context, responding to genuine fears with methods that their society endorsed. This is both comforting and disturbing. Comforting, because it means witch hunting wasn't the result of individual evil, but of systemic failures of reasoning and institutional checks. Disturbing because it suggests that ordinary people like us, can participate in terrible things when the right conditions align. Modern individuals reading about witch trials often wonder, would I have gone along? Would I have accused my neighbours, testified against them, or stood in the crowd watching executions? The uncomfortable truth is that most of us probably would have, not because we're bad people, but because social pressure, cultural assumptions, and the architecture of our beliefs shape behaviour in ways that are very difficult to resist individually. The heroes of witch trial history are often those who said no, when everyone around them was saying yes, the judges who refused to convict despite community pressure, the neighbours who testified in favour of accused witches despite the risk to their own reputations. The ministers questioned whether spectral evidence should be trusted. These individuals demonstrated that resistance was possible, that going along wasn't inevitable, and that individual choice retained meaning even within oppressive systems. But celebrating these resistors shouldn't let the rest of us off the hook too. Easily, for every person who resisted, hundreds participated or stood silently by. The witch trials happened not because a few evil people forced them on reluctant communities, but because communities largely supported them, saw them as necessary, and participated willingly. Any honest reckoning with this history requires acknowledging that most people, most of the time, go along with what their society tells them is right and necessary. The lesson isn't that we should feel guilty for what our ancestors did. Collective. Guilt across centuries makes no sense. The lesson is that we should examine our own certainties, our own community's scapegoats, and our own participation in systems that might look unjust to future generations. What beliefs do we hold now that will seem as obviously wrong in 300 years as witch hunting seems to us? The witch trials teach us to be suspicious of accusations that are impossible to disprove, of evidence that consists mainly of reputation and rumour, of legal systems that treat confession as the only path to mercy, and of communities that need enemies to maintain cohesion. They teach us that fear is a terrible foundation for justice, that panic makes people capable of cruelty they'd normally reject, and that the difference between civilization and barbarism is thinner than we'd like to believe. They also teach us something about the endurance of human communities despite terrible mistakes. Salem didn't disappear after 1692, Würzburg recovered from its trials. Communities that burned witches went on to become peaceful towns where people lived ordinary lives, raised children, tended gardens, and mostly forgot what their ancestors had done. Humans are remarkably good at moving on, at forgetting, at rebuilding normal life after extraordinary cruelty. Whether this resilience is admirable or troubling depends on your perspective. It's admirable that communities can recover from collective madness. It's troubling that they can do well enough that the lessons might not be learned, that future generations might be susceptible to similar dynamics because the memory has faded. The physical traces of witch trials are mostly gone. A few memorial stones, some preserved documents, and historical markers in places where executions occurred. The dead left no graves to visit, their bodies having been burned or buried without ceremony in many cases. The absence of physical memorials makes the history feel more distant, easier to dismiss as something that happened long ago and couldn't happen now. But the absence of memorials also means we carry this history internally as a story we tell about human nature and social dynamics rather than as a specific place we can visit and leave behind. The witch trials exist now primarily as a cautionary tale, as a metaphor, as a warning, and perhaps that's the form in which they're most useful. As you prepare for sleep, consider that the same darkness that once held such terror for our ancestors now holds a kind of peace. The night is no longer populated with demons and malevolent spirits. The shadows in the corner of your room are just shadows, the creaking of the house is just wood settling, and the neighbour who seems strange is just someone with different habits and preferences. This demystification of the night, this taming of darkness through understanding, represents one of modernity's genuine gifts. We've lost the enchanted universe where magic was real and spirits walked among us, but we've gained a world where random misfortune doesn't require malevolent explanation, where your neighbour's eccentricity doesn't make them dangerous, and where difference doesn't equal threat. The last person executed for witchcraft died centuries ago. The last official witch trial ended long before anyone now living was born. The machinery of persecution that operated for so long has been dismantled, its methods discredited, and its assumptions rejected. This is progress worth acknowledging, even as we remain alert to how similar dynamics might manifest in different forms. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you can do so without fear that someone might accuse you of impossible crimes, that your midnight dreams might be used as evidence against you, or that your spirit might be claimed to have left your sleeping body to harm your neighbours. These fears, which once seemed perfectly reasonable to millions of people, have been consigned to history, but history is never as distant as we imagine. The human tendencies that produced witch trials, the need to explain suffering, the comfort of identifying enemies, the power of accusations, the danger of certainty, remain with us. The forms change, but the patterns persist, appearing in different contexts with different vocabularies, but recognisable structures. The witch trials remind us that civilization is an achievement requiring constant maintenance, that justice is fragile, and that mercy must be chosen again and again. They remind us to be sceptical of our own certainties, compassionate toward those accused, careful about how we explain misfortune, and humble about how much we truly know. They also remind us that individuals matter, that choices matter, and that resistance is possible even when it's difficult. The people who spoke up for accused witches, who questioned the proceedings, who refused to participate in persecution despite pressure. These individuals demonstrated that we're not helpless before social forces, that moral courage remains meaningful, even when it's uncommon. As your eyes grow heavy and the room around you softens into the gentle blur of approaching sleep, you might spare a thought for all those accused of impossible things, for communities torn apart by fear, and for the slow, uneven progress toward more just and rational ways of handling misfortune and difference. The story of witches, from belief through persecution to the fading of the trials, is ultimately a story about learning. Humanity learned, slowly and at terrible cost, that supernatural explanations for misfortune were unnecessary, that accusations required evidence, that difference didn't equal danger, and that mercy was stronger than fear. These lessons weren't learned perfectly or completely. They weren't learned everywhere simultaneously. They had to be learned again and again, sometimes forgotten and relearned. But they were learned, and the world became, in this respect at least, a gentler place. Sleep now, in your safe, comfortable bed, in your room that holds no demons, in your community that doesn't burn witches. Sleep, knowing that the darkness outside your window is just the absence of light, that your strange dreams are just your brain processing information, and that your difficult neighbour is just a person with different views and habits. The witch trials are over. Their lessons remain, and that combination, the end of one horror, the preservation of its lessons, represents one of history's quiet victories, the kind that doesn't announce itself with trumpets and celebrations, but simply makes ordinary life possible for ordinary people. Tomorrow you'll wake to a world where witches exist only in Halloween decorations and fantasy novels, where history has become story, and where the fears that once seemed so reasonable now seem incomprehensible. And that change from reasonable fear to incomprehensible superstition represents not just the passage of time, but the slow, uneven, precious growth of human understanding. Rest well, knowing that this particular darkness has been illuminated, that this particular fear has been named and understood, and that this particular mistake is now preserved as a cautionary tale rather than repeated as a tragic practice. The night holds only night, the darkness holds only darkness, and that in its own quiet way is something close to grace. Sleep well. The witch trials are history, and morning always comes. Your earliest ancestors were performing before Netflix, before Broadway, and before anyone even considered charging for entertainment. Imagine a cave from 40,000 years ago. The fire is crackling. Someone begins to tell a story about the day's mammoth hunt, and the dishes are finished. Well, there weren't dishes, but you get the idea. The interesting part, though, is that they did more than merely recount the tale. Oh no, that would be too easy. Someone took a mammoth hide and began to play the role of the mammoth. Someone else posed as the courageous hunter, to symbolize the shaman who blessed the hunt. A third person picked up some berries and painted stripes on their face. Before you know it, you have the first dinner theatre in human history, complete with method acting, real costumes, and a small, intimate setting. Remember, these weren't just any old shenanigans. Directors of contemporary community theatre would be envious of the practical uses of these early productions. Important survival knowledge, such as which berries won't kill you, and how to avoid becoming something else's dinner, was passed down thanks to them. They strengthened ties within the community because nothing unites people like seeing Uncle Grok perform his encounter with a saber-toothed tiger for the 15th time, complete with homemade sound effects and increasingly complex mime work. The irony is that we were already formulating what would eventually become the fundamental principle of all performances. The audience must voluntarily suspend their disbelief. Everyone gathered around that fire was well aware that it wasn't actually a mammoth, but rather Bob in a fur suit, his hands cupped around his mouth, making trumpet-like noises. However, they consented to comply, allowing themselves to be drawn into the narrative. Even though the costumes have become much more elaborate and the venues are much less likely to be overrun by real wild animals, that is the magic contract between the performer and the audience that still exists today. These early performances also appear to have been more than casual affairs, according to archaeological evidence. Figures wearing ornate headdresses and participating in ritualistic activities are depicted in cave paintings from Lascaux and other locations in what seem to be ceremonial poses. Certain cave formations, according to some researchers, were picked especially for their acoustic qualities, natural amphitheatres, where tales could be told and retold with the most dramatic effect. These early societies' performance traditions evolved along with them. Coming-of-age rituals, successful hunts, territorial agreements, and seasonal celebrations of the solstices all became occasions for ever more complicated theatrical performances. The shaman or tribal storyteller developed into something like a director, directing group activities and maintaining the customs of telling some stories. A few thousand years later, you're in ancient Egypt, where someone had the brilliant notion that if ordinary stories were good, then stories about pharaohs and gods must be fantastic, with intricate costumes, makeup techniques that would make a contemporary drag queen weep with admiration, and scripts, hieroglyphic ones, of course. The Egyptians transformed the primal human urge to perform into something that approached. Professional theatre. In essence, Egyptian religious ceremonies were high-stakes theatrical productions. If you fumbled your lines, you risked upsetting a god, which was far worse than receiving a poor review in the local papyrus. Nor were these solemn, quiet services. They were grand events with hundreds of participants, intricate processions and special effects that must have appeared completely magical to viewers who were unaware of their workings. The story of the god's death and resurrection was narrated over several days of performances that swept across entire cities during the yearly Osiris festivals, which were especially theatrical. Parts of the story would be assigned to different neighbourhoods, resulting in a theatrical experience that stretched throughout the entire city and made contemporary site-specific theatre appear positively modest. The fact that Egyptian performance created numerous customs that still exist today is what makes it so fascinating. They created complex methods for implying supernatural happenings on stage, such as trapdoors for gods to come and go, ornate masks and costumes to turn human actors into gods, and meticulously planned movements that gave the appearance of supernatural strength. The idea of a theatrical season linked to agricultural and religious calendars was also invented by the Egyptians. A year-round cycle of theatrical activity that kept audiences interested and performers employed was created by the various festivals that held various kinds of performances throughout the year. They realised something that contemporary theatre producers are still discovering. Audience loyalty is increased by consistent programming. Papyri and Egyptian tomb paintings also demonstrate that these performances weren't stuffy or overly solemn. There was a place for comedy, frequently in the form of minor characters and servants who offered light-hearted relief from the more sombre divine drama. The Egyptians recognised that audiences needed a few laughs to keep things from becoming too serious, even in tales about life, death, and eternal judgment. We now travel to ancient Greece, where someone had the brilliant idea to elevate storytelling to a formal activity, complete with regulations, contests, and the kind of critical thinking that would make graduate students today feel completely at home. It was impossible for the Greeks, bless them, to simply appreciate a good story. They had to classify it, evaluate it, and then most likely compose a philosophical treatise on whether or not it effectively elicited catharsis through fear and pity. The Greeks created what is now known as formal drama during religious festivals celebrating Dionysus, the god of wine, which explains a lot about theatre's relationship with altered states of consciousness, in the 6th century BCE. Picture the scene. Throngs of people gathered in massive outdoor amphitheatres carved into the sides of hills, listening to actors in flowing robes and ornate masks narrate tales of heroes, gods, and the occasional dysfunctional family that would make contemporary soap operas appear positively restrained. Let's take a moment to discuss those amphitheatres, though, as they were engineering wonders that contemporary architects continue to admire. About 17,000 people could fit in Athens' Theatre of Dionysus, and the acoustics were so well designed that a whisper from the stage could be heard in the back row. Excellent knowledge of sound and space without the use of microphones or amplification. Every audience member had an unhindered view of the action thanks to the seating arrangement, which was set up in a perfect semicircle. By the way, the masks weren't merely decorative. The person in the back row, who is likely squinting and questioning whether they should have brought their antiquated equivalent of opera glasses, needed something to help project emotion in those enormous amphitheatres. These masks were artistic creations, carved to symbolise various character types and emotions. Happy, sad, angry, confused. All the emotions you go through on a normal Monday morning, but artistically captured in plaster, wood and linen that would make contemporary designers cry. The Greeks are credited with creating the idea of the tragic hero, but they also unintentionally created stage fright. His name lives on in the word thespian, though I'm sure he never imagined future actors would use it to sound more important at dinner parties. Imagine poor Thespis, who is frequently regarded as the first actor, standing alone on stage for the first time and likely thinking, "What have I gotten myself into? Yesterday I participated in a chorus, and now suddenly everyone is staring at me, expecting me to be engaging on my own." Greek tragedy dealt with serious issues such as justice, fate, family honour, and whether or not the gods were amused at human expense. Spoiler alert, they usually were. Aeschylus created what were effectively ancient miniseries with greater production values and more divine intervention through his trilogies, which examined a single theme across several plays. In order to create that delicious tension that keeps you wriggling in your seat, Sophocles perfected the art of dramatic irony, in which the audience knows something that the characters do not. However, the Greeks also provided us with comedy, and it was politically incorrect and delightfully crude in ways that would make audiences today gasp and then giggle in private. Because Aristophanes' plays were full of political satire, bathroom humour, and the kind of jokes that made respectable citizens clutch their togas and pretend to be scandalised while actually enjoying every minute, he would have thrived on social media. It is impossible to exaggerate how competitive Greek theatre is. Playwrights, actors and choruses competed for prizes and public recognition during the dramatic festivals. which were more than just parties. Think of the Olympics for the theatre, complete with all the political scheming, artistic competitions and heated public arguments over the judges, while losers likely went home and grumbled about the judges not appreciating their artistic vision. Winners rose to fame throughout the Greek world. The chorus was the centre of these productions, despite being frequently disregarded in contemporary discussions of Greek theatre. They were talented performers who represented the voice of the community in the play by dancing, singing and commenting on the action. They weren't merely background singers. A production's success or failure depended on its chorus, and training one required months of rigorous rehearsal. When the Romans saw Greek theatre, they thought, "This is nice, but what if we made it bigger, more spectacular, and threw in some gladiators?" Because if the Romans were good at anything, it was taking someone else's brilliant idea and making it much better with more marble, more violence, and much better engineering. Roman theatre was entertainment on a scale that would make contemporary production companies shiver with fear and jealousy. They constructed massive theatres, some of which could accommodate up to 40,000 people. Can you imagine packing a theatre that big today for a single dramatic performance rather than a sporting event or rock concert? Rome's 20,000-seat Theatre of Marcellus was so exquisitely designed that portions of it still stand today and are used as the base for Renaissance palaces that were erected on its remains. The Romans changed theatrical technology in ways that would not be matched until the modern era, but they didn't stop at size. They featured elaborate set pieces that could be changed between acts using sophisticated machinery hidden beneath the stage floor. Hoists that could lift actors into the air to represent gods or flying creatures, and trapdoors that were controlled by intricate mechanical systems, special effects that wouldn't look out of place in a contemporary theme park. Roman theatre engineering produced the first retractable awnings to shield spectators from the sun and rain, intricate subterranean spaces beneath the stage for the storage of equipment and sets, and even crude air conditioners that cooled the air on hot days using aqueduct water. Instead of relying on ideal weather, they made going to the theatre a cosy year-round activity. From a social point of view, this is where Roman theatre becomes truly fascinating. The Romans viewed theatre more like we do television today. Popular entertainment for the masses, supported by the government or wealthy sponsors, and intended to keep the populace content and distracted. This is in contrast to the Greeks, who saw theatre as both entertainment and a spiritual experience connected to religious festivals. Free admission was provided by wealthy individuals seeking social status or politicians hoping to win over voters. The shows had to be suitable for everyone, from senators to dock workers, in order to appeal to the widest possible audience. This democratic approach to entertainment gave rise to storytelling innovations that put mass appeal ahead of creative experimentation. The clever servant who was always smarter than his master, the young lover who was attractive but not very intelligent, the irascible old man whose stinginess caused most of the plot complications, and the cunning parasite who flattered wealthy. Patrons in exchange for food and favours were all examples of stock characters that audiences would instantly recognise in Roman comedies. Does that sound familiar? Even today, these character types can be found in sitcoms and romantic comedies. The ensemble comedy model that we still use today, 2,000 years later, was essentially established by the Romans. It is impossible to overestimate the impact of Roman comedy on subsequent theatrical traditions. Throughout the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, plays by Plautus and Terence were studied and copied. Shakespeare directly appropriated Roman storylines and character types. Roman theatre is the source of the fundamental framework of romantic comedy, which consists of young lovers kept apart by obstacles, complications involving mistaken identities, and a resolution in which everyone gets married. However, the idea of theatre as a spectacle for public amusement was also invented by the Romans. Their successful productions travelled from city to city across the empire, establishing the first theatrical touring circuit. To bring professional entertainment to provincial towns that might never otherwise see anything more sophisticated than local festivals, picture the logistics of transporting entire acting companies, elaborate sets, and costumes across hundreds of miles of Roman roads. Roman audiences were infamously picky and outspoken about what they liked. They had no qualms about vocally and instantly expressing their disapproval if they didn't enjoy a performance. Both positive and negative effects on the development of theatre resulted from this, as it established a culture in which popularity and entertainment value were valued more highly than artistic ambition. The first celebrity culture centred on performers was also created by the Romans. Actors who achieved success became well known throughout the empire, and rumours and conjecture surrounded their private lives. Does that sound familiar? They invented the idea of a touring star who could attract audiences just by virtue of their reputation, going from city to city to play their most well-liked parts. You might assume that theatre simply put on its masks and went home for a few centuries after the fall of Rome. It had to be extremely inventive about where it lived and how it survived, but not quite. The early Christian church had conflicting opinions about theatrical performances. On the one hand, they disapproved of Roman theatre's connection to violence, pagan festivals, and general immorality. However, they soon discovered that religious stories could be effectively taught through performance to those who were illiterate, which was the majority of the population. As a result, theatre found a new home in churches, beginning with straightforward Bible story reenactments during services. Imagine that during Easter morning services, members of the congregation would pretend that Christ's empty tomb had been discovered. This would likely involve improvised costumes and a good deal of nervous laughter from amateur actors who had never performed on stage before. Since Latin, the church's official language, was typically used for these early liturgical dramas, the majority of the audience was more interested in the spectacle than in fully comprehending every word. This resulted in increasingly complex visual presentations that use staging, costume and action rather than speech to convey narrative and emotion. The Easter story was briefly dramatised in the Cem Quiritus trope, which is frequently cited as the origin of all medieval drama. It began as a straightforward call and response between a clergyman who represented the angel at the tomb and another clergyman who represented the three Marys searching for Christ's body. Jesus of Nazareth. He is not here, he is risen. Whom do you seek? This is where medieval theatre becomes wonderfully human and charmingly chaotic. These religious performances outgrew the churches as they became more elaborate and well-liked. Entire communities participated in large-scale productions known as morality plays, which were essentially medieval after-school specials with titles like Everyman and The Castle of Perseverance, or mystery plays, which told biblical stories. These local productions were pulled by wagons known as pageant wagons, which would move around a town, stopping at various stations during the day. The carpenters would be in charge of Noah's Ark, naturally. The bakers would be in charge of the miracle of the loaves and fishes. The metalworkers would likely be stuck with any scenes that required armour or weapons. And the goldsmiths' guild would usually be in charge of the scenes involving the three wise men and their pricey gifts. Part of what made medieval theatre so charming was that the outcomes were frequently hilariously uneven. Imagine going to a play where Noah's Ark was constructed by real carpenters and looked amazing, and then right after that there's a scene where the angels are obviously just the apprentices of the baker, dressed in bed sheets, and they're desperately trying not to trip over their makeshift wings. For one day's performance, the Guild of Shipwrights would make an ark that could actually float. The Guild of Weavers might make costumes that were works of art, and the Guild of Blacksmiths would forge armour that was entirely authentic. The way that medieval performance combined the sacred and the ridiculous without seeming to care about tonal consistency was one of its most delightful features. Comic relief characters would appear everywhere, even in the most religious productions. In nativity plays, the shepherds were frequently portrayed as foolish country people who offered amusement in between the more sombre scenes. In the midst of a tale about divine judgment and salvation, there is slapstick humour because Noah's wife was traditionally a shrewish character who refused to board the ark without a fight. One of the most well-known medieval dramas, The Second Shepherd's Play, has a subplot about a sheep thief who attempts to conceal his stolen sheep by posing it as his newborn child, with his wife cradling it and saying it only has a peculiar complexion. This farce parallels the nativity story, resulting in a play that serves as both popular entertainment and religious instruction. We sometimes forget that medieval audiences recognised that a little humour helped make difficult spiritual subjects easier to understand and more memorable. They were being pragmatic, not disrespectful. You need to give them something to laugh at and something to think about if you want them to remember the lessons in your play. Medieval drama was staged in a way that was both inventive and useful. The majority of performances were held outside in marketplaces or town squares, so portable and weatherproof stage designs were required. The pageant wagon system made it possible for several plays to be presented at various venues at the same time, resulting in a festival-like atmosphere that persisted for days. Some communities created staging systems that were even more complex. In order to follow the entire biblical story from creation to Judgment Day, audiences moved between the Chester Mystery Plays, which were presented on a number of fixed stages spread out across the city. In order to create enormous outdoor festivals that attracted people from hundreds of miles away, other communities constructed makeshift amphitheatres in fields outside of town. Theatrical aspirations grew in tandem with the prosperity of medieval society and the size of urban centres. Productions became more complex in the 14th and 15th centuries, pushing the limits of what was possible with medieval technology. Hundreds of actors and crew members participated in these enormous multi-day passion plays during this time period. We can get a sense of the scale these productions could reach from the 1634 started Oberammergau Passion Play. Medieval adaptations were frequently even more ornate, with casts that included entire communities, numerous stages, and sophisticated special effects equipment. The technology used for staging advanced. Biblical miracles were cleverly addressed by medieval stage managers who created intricate mechanisms for parting seas or simulating divine fire, flying rigs for angelic appearances, and trapdoors for resurrection scenes. Medieval stage designers developed a specialty for depicting the mouth of hell, which is frequently a massive dragon head with a movable jaw that can swallow the damned while belching smoke and flames. Medieval theatre had a significant economic component. Investing heavily in costumes, materials, and specialised craftwork was necessary for large productions. Guilds would train for their designated scenes for months, and the rivalry between them to produce the best show became a source of artistic innovation and civic pride. According to records from York, England, the mystery play cycle in the city involved 48 different wagons, and most of the adult population as organisers, craftspeople or performers. The play's economic impact was so great that they became popular tourist destinations, bringing in large sums of money for nearby merchants and innkeepers. Humanism, literacy, and the radical notion that perhaps, just possibly, the average person should have access to entertainment that wasn't solely concerned with their eternal souls, and moral advancement were all introduced during the Renaissance. Professional theatre as we know it began during this time, with permanent companies, specially constructed theatres, and the groundbreaking idea that actors could earn a living doing what they did without having to become carpenters or farmers. With stock characters that wore recognisable masks and costumes that have become so iconic that they are still instantly recognisable today, the Commedia dell'arte in Italy was perfecting improvisational comedy, with exaggerated features that allowed actors to project personality even to audiences seated close enough to see their eyes through the mask's eye holes. These were not your sombre Greek masks made to project emotion across enormous amphitheatres. Instead, they were made for intimate comedy. The fundamental character types: Pantalone, the wealthy old merchant who was constantly being conned out of his money; Il Capitano, the blustery soldier who talked endlessly about his military exploits, but turned out to be a coward when faced with real danger; Arlecchino, the cunning servant who was always smarter than his supposed betters; and the young lovers, who were typically beautiful but not particularly blessed with common sense, became so popular that they spread throughout Europe more quickly than Renaissance pasta recipes. Commedia dell'arte is especially endearing because, although the fundamental storylines and character types were the same for all acting companies, a large portion of the dialogue was improvised. Over the course of years or even decades, actors would hone their characters, coming up with unique vocal patterns, physical gestures, and running jokes that viewers would find entertaining. The audience expected the same characters to appear in each performance, albeit with slightly different circumstances and complications, so it was similar to watching a Renaissance take on improvisational comedy. The basic plot outlines or scenarios were handed down from one company to another and grew more complex. Mistaken identities, young lovers attempting to outsmart their parents, servants who were simultaneously assisting and impeding their masters, and enough physical humour to keep audiences laughing even when they couldn't fully follow the plot. Complications are all common elements of Commedia dell'arte performances. With their own costumes, props, musical instruments, and specialised equipment for outdoor performances, these travelling companies were effectively small businesses. They kept their main character types and scenarios while travelling from town to town throughout Italy and eventually throughout Europe, tailoring their performances to local languages and tastes. At the same time, something remarkable was taking place in England that would forever alter the field of theatrical literature. However, let's face it, Elizabethan theatre was not the reverent, hushed experience you might expect from something we now study with such academic seriousness. The Elizabethan era produced what many consider the greatest flowering of dramatic literature in the English language. Unlike the calm, reflective settings we now associate with serious drama, Elizabethan theatres were noisy, boisterous spaces that functioned more like a hybrid of a social club and a sporting event. Because they were on ground level, the audience known as groundlings stood in the pit and felt completely free to applaud heroes, hiss villains, and hurl objects at performers they didn't like. In general, they treated the performance as an interactive experience. They consumed food while the show was going on. Vendors offered beer, apples, and nuts. They went to the theatre to see and be seen in London society, made business deals, and flirted with possible love interests. They told the actors bluntly if a play was dull, sometimes to the extent that actors would act out of character, to argue with loud audience members. Within the limitations of Elizabethan economics and technology, the theatres themselves were marvels of practical design. They were open to the sky in the middle, so performances relied on favourable weather and natural light. They were mostly made of wood and had thatched roofs. Fire was a constant worry. The Globe Theatre burned down in 1613 when a cannon effect went wrong, during a performance of Henry VIII. The weather and daylight hours dictated the performance schedules. Winter meant earlier start times or shorter plays. Even though some theatres had enough covered seating to continue with smaller audiences during light precipitation, rain could completely cancel performances. It was a straightforward yet elegant stage design, an intimacy that is hard to attain in contemporary proscenium theatres, where the audience is seated on one side of the action, was created by the main platform protruding into the audience. Hamlet stood a few feet away from some audience members during his soliloquies, allowing him to observe their distinct faces and determine how they responded to his remarks. Depending on the needs of the play, the gallery above the main stage could symbolise heaven, castle walls, or balconies. Trapdoors allowed supernatural characters to emerge from hell, a space beneath the stage. There was a curtained space behind the stage that could be used as a cave, an inner room, or anything else the script called for. These theatres relied on the imagination of the audience and the playwright's words to create atmosphere and location because they had little scenery and no lighting effects. You were aware that we would eventually arrive. 400 years later, high school students still complain about having to read William Shakespeare, and theatre professionals are still trying to understand how he was able to be so consistently brilliant while managing a theatre company and, likely worrying about paying the rent. Shakespeare was writing popular entertainment for a wide range of readers, not literature for future English classes. This is the aspect of Shakespeare that is frequently overlooked in all the scholarly analysis and reverent treatment. He worked as a playwright in a fiercely competitive commercial theatre setting, producing plays on short notice for audiences who could not stand pretense and who had plenty of other things to do if his productions didn't hold their attention. Shakespeare's genius lay in his ability to work on several levels at once, without making anyone feel condescending or excluded. Sword fights, puns, and obscene jokes that would make a contemporary R-rating committee blush were all part of the experience for the groundlings who paid a penny to stand in the pit. Sophisticated wordplay, classical references, and intricate psychological insights that unveiled new layers upon repeated viewing were provided to the educated nobility who paid more for seats in the galleries. Everyone heard gripping tales of betrayal, power struggles, love, dysfunctional families, and the sporadic appearance of ghosts to add even more difficulty to an already challenging circumstance. His comedies, which were full of misidentifications, cross-dressing characters, romantic confusion that degenerates into delightful chaos, and the kind of wordplay that makes you laugh and moan at the same time, were truly funny in ways that are still relevant today. With a villain plot that primarily provides the other characters with interesting things to react to, and enough clever dialogue to fuel several contemporary sitcoms, Much Ado About Nothing is essentially a romantic comedy about two couples who approach love from entirely different perspectives. His histories transformed dull political events, which the majority of his audience only knew in passing, into exciting adventures full of endearing characters who seemed more real than the historical figures they purportedly represented. Through stirring battle speeches and character interactions, Henry V turns a medieval military campaign into a reflection on leadership, accountability, and the price of political ambition. This keeps audiences interested even if they are not very interested in English foreign policy in the 14th century and his misfortunes. Yes, they are tragic, but in the most fulfilling sense of the word. They deal with major themes like fate, ambition, love, and retribution. But they do so by showing flawed, complex characters making decisions that have terrible outcomes. In addition to being a play about a prince who must exact revenge on his father, Hamlet is also about a person attempting to live honourably in a corrupt society, and how the quest for perfect justice can destroy everything you're attempting to defend. Shakespeare's comprehension of human psychology in all its contradictory complexity was what truly made him unique, because his characters, like real people, have internal contradictions. They seem authentic. Frequently in the same scene, Hamlet exhibits both decisiveness and indecision, bravery and cowardice, and cruelty and love. Lady Macbeth is a fiercely ambitious and extremely vulnerable person who can both plan murder and be destroyed by guilt. Iago is incredibly cunning and strangely petty, driven by resentments that don't fully excuse the complex retaliation he plans. Shakespeare was also more aware of the desire of audiences for variety in a single evening's entertainment than most playwrights before or since. His plays combine court scenes and tavern scenes, high poetry and everyday prose, and comedy and tragedy, all within single stories that manage to remain cohesive despite their complex tones. Drama, comedy, action, philosophy and poetry are all combined into one experience that somehow feels cohesive rather than dispersed, making it similar to receiving a full entertainment package. Hamlet contains a variety of content, including a ghost story, a political thriller, a family drama, a romantic tragedy, a revenge plot, a play within a play, sword fights, philosophical soliloquies, court intrigue, and some of the most hilarious gravedigger scenes in dramatic literature. Shakespeare managed to make that list function as a single, seamless experience, but any contemporary entertainment executive would insist on dividing it into at least 3 distinct products. Shakespeare was essentially creating modern English as he wrote, so the language merits special attention. Shakespeare created or first used many of the words and expressions we use on a daily basis in his plays. He intuitively saw that language could be both poetic and conversational, elegant and approachable, and beautiful and useful. His character's speech sounds both heightened and natural, poetic and realistic. Dramatic development was as much influenced by the actual theatre locations as it was by the playwrights and performers who performed there. A microcosm of Elizabethan society and a device built to produce particular types of theatrical experiences, the Globe Theatre was more than just a place where many of Shakespeare's plays had their world premieres. The Globe's social geography provides us with a wealth of information about Elizabethan views on community, entertainment and class. The groundlings stood in the pit for a penny, which was less expensive than a loaf of bread, and the least expensive form of entertainment in London. A seat in the galleries, where you would be shielded from the elements and have a better view of the action, would cost an additional penny. Although they most likely couldn't hear much conversation and undoubtedly disrupted the staging, the most expensive seats were actually on the stage itself, where affluent patrons could see and be seen by the rest of the audience. It was revolutionary to bring together people from different social classes in one place. Where else could a pickpocket, a nobleman and a shopkeeper all enjoy the same entertainment in the same place at the same time, in the strict hierarchical Elizabethan society? In London, theatre emerged as one of the few genuinely democratic establishments where individuals from wildly disparate backgrounds could share similar experiences and responses. It's easy to ignore the ways in which the architecture of these theatres impacted dramatic writing. Plays had to be performed during the day because there was no artificial lighting, so night scenes had to be completely set up through staging and dialogue. The actors must use their words and deeds alone to persuade a daytime audience that it is nighttime when Romeo ascends to Juliet's balcony. As playwrights learned to use words to create vivid images rather than lighting effects, this limitation produced some of the most exquisite descriptive language in English literature. With the platform extending far into the audience area, the thrust stage arrangement produced an intimacy that is difficult for contemporary theatres to replicate. Every performance felt immediate and intimate because the actors were literally surrounded by audience members on 3 sides. Instead of being performed to the back wall of the theatre or to empty air, soliloquies were shared directly with audience members who could touch them, fostering a sense of mutual confidence and conspiracy between the performer and the audience. Shakespeare and his contemporaries had to use dialogue, costumes and small props to create setting and atmosphere because there was a dearth of ornate scenery. A bed could turn the stage into a bedroom, a throne signified a palace, and a few branches suggested a forest. Instead of just showing viewers preset images, this economy of means compelled playwrights to be resourceful and audiences to be creative, resulting in a collaborative theatrical experience that stimulated viewers' creativity. Actors had to be incredibly adaptable because Elizabethan theatre companies used a repertory system. In a week, a single company may present 6 different plays, requiring actors to learn and play dozens of roles at once. With little rehearsal time, the top actor in a company such as Shakespeare's company, the Lord Chamberlain's men, would have to be ready to play a variety of characters and styles, such as King Lear on Wednesday, Benedick in Much Ado About Nothing on Tuesday and Hamlet on Monday. Additionally, because of this system, plays were written with particular actors in mind. Shakespeare customised roles for each member of his company based on their individual strengths, weaknesses, and peculiarities. Will Kempe and Robert Armin, both of whom had distinct comedic philosophies and specialties, were the intended recipients of the clown parts. The tragic parts were written for Richard Burbage, who apparently had a regular ability to bring people to tears. English theatre started to undergo minor but important changes in 1603 when James I came to power. The emergence of private indoor theatres that catered to more affluent audiences coincided with the reign of the new king, who was more interested in lavish court entertainments than in public theatre. Shakespeare's company started its winter performances at the Blackfriars Theatre, which was a far cry from the public amphitheatres. It was more intimate, smaller, artificially candlelit, and admission was much pricier. Playwrights were inspired to experiment with more psychologically complex material and advanced theatrical techniques as a result of the more affluent and educated audience this attracted. Themes of corruption, insanity, and moral ambiguity were explored in darker, more psychologically complex plays written by playwrights such as John Webster, Thomas Middleton, and John Ford. With their graphic violence, sexual transgression, and moral complexity, The Duchess of Malfi, The White Devil, and 'Tis Pity She's a Whore challenged the conventions of what was appropriate for staging in outdoor amphitheatres during the day. More advanced staging methods were also made possible by the indoor theatres. Opportunities for atmospheric effects, abrupt illuminations, and the type of chiaroscuro lighting that painters of the era were employing to produce striking visual effects were made possible by candlelight. When audiences were unable to see all of the mechanical operations clearly, trapdoors and flying machinery could be used more successfully. In indoor theatres, music has grown in significance as a means of providing entertainment in between acts, as well as an accompaniment to the action. The development of what would eventually become theatrical orchestration as an artistic discipline, and more subdued musical effects, was made possible by the acoustics of enclosed spaces. English theatre achieved unprecedented levels of sophistication and artistic achievement during Charles I's reign, but it also began to temporarily decline. Court masques evolved into increasingly complex spectacles that fused dance, music, theatre, and visual arts in productions that were expensive and primarily used to showcase the wealth and power of the monarchy. Playwrights such as John Ford, Philip Massinger, and James Shirley produced works of significant artistic value, and public theatre flourished. However, a confrontation that would temporarily put an end to professional theatre in England was being sparked by the growing Puritan opposition to theatre as politically dangerous and morally corrupting. One of the greatest eras in English dramatic literature came to an end in 1642, when Parliament passed an ordinance banning all public theatres. Actors and playwrights were forced underground or into exile during England's 18-year ban on professional theatre. The theatrical impulse and human nature, however, have a wonderful quality that makes it impossible to eradicate theatre through legislation. Theatrical activity persisted in disguised forms throughout the Commonwealth era. The theatrical tradition was maintained through private performances in aristocratic homes, travelling entertainers who were careful not to identify as actors, and even some public performances that were passed off as musical concerts or instructional demonstrations. At fairs and markets, droll performances, brief comedic excerpts taken from longer plays, were presented, frequently with actors prepared to disperse if officials showed up. By offering moral instruction that coincidentally involved costumed actors enacting better stories, some theatrical entrepreneurs came up with inventive ways to get around the bans. When the monarchy was reinstated in 1660, theatre made a comeback to England, but with some notable modifications that would permanently alter the art form. For the first time, women were allowed to act on professional stages, which seems like such an obvious innovation that you wonder why it took so long to occur to anyone. In the past, young men were cast in all-female roles, which created some intriguing theatrical complications when characters in stories pretended to be the opposite gender. The ability to see real women portraying women opened up new avenues for dramatic characterization and romantic comedy. Additionally, male audience members occasionally showed greater interest in the actresses than in the plays they were performing, which led to new issues. The most well-known Restoration actress, Nell Gwynn, is a prime example of this shift's advantages and disadvantages. This conflict between artistic success and personal fame would haunt actresses for centuries, as they benefited from professional opportunities while confronting social stigmas that did not apply to their male counterparts. She was a truly gifted performer who could handle comedy and tragedy with equal skill. but she's more famous today for being King Charles II's mistress. Comedy of manners and other sophisticated plays about the social intrigues of the upper classes also gained popularity during the Restoration era. Instead of being broad physical comedies, these were clever verbal entertainments that deftly parodied romantic pretenses and social norms. Consider them the forerunners of contemporary romantic comedies, albeit with tighter corsets, more complex language, and a markedly more pessimistic outlook on marriage and faithfulness. Perhaps the best example of Restoration comedy is William Congreve's The Way of the World, which features characters who navigate romantic and financial complexities with well-crafted epigrams that only true intelligence can understand. There is a lot of wit in the conversation, but it is used as a weapon in complex social warfare where reputation and wealth are at stake. Compared to their Elizabethan forebears, Restoration theatres evolved into more elegant spaces that increasingly catered to affluent patrons prepared to shell out more cash for cosier surroundings. Imported from Italian architecture, the proscenium arch theatre improved the audience-performer relationship by separating the two in subtle yet significant ways. With painted backdrops and wing flats that could be switched between acts to imply different locations, the scenery grew increasingly ornate, although it also meant that plays relied less on the imagination of the audience and more on visual spectacle. This marked a shift toward theatrical illusionism that would rule stage design for the next 2 centuries. Sentimentalism, the groundbreaking notion that viewers should be emotionally affected by what they saw rather than merely amused or intellectually stimulated, was introduced to theatre in the 1700s. Domestic tragedy and plays about common middle-class people dealing with moral quandaries, as opposed to kings and nobles handling state affairs and divine intervention, became more popular during this time. With its emphasis on a young apprentice whose moral decline is caused by common human frailties, rather than fatal character defects or supernatural intervention, George Lillow's The London Merchant was revolutionary. By establishing the idea that theatre could and should represent the experiences of its audience, rather than merely offering escapist entertainment about exotic people in extraordinary circumstances, this move toward emotional realism and relatable characters set the foundation for modern drama. Emotional responsiveness and moral sensitivity were given new significance by the cult of sensibility that ruled 18th century society. Touching scenes were supposed to make audiences cry, and the number of handkerchiefs needed in the theatre on any given night was frequently used to gauge a play's success. Although this may seem too sentimental by today's standards, it was a significant acknowledgement that theatre could be used to explore emotional and moral complexity, in addition to offering obscene entertainment. By creating a more naturalistic performance style that prioritised psychological realism over exclamatory technique, David Garrick transformed acting during this time. Garrick researched human behaviour and attempted to replicate it authentically on stage rather than posing and giving speeches in a formal, oratorical way. His portrayal of Hamlet received accolades for not looking like an actor giving well-known speeches, but rather like a real person dealing with real psychological issues. In addition, Garrick invented a number of theatrical techniques that are now commonplace. He was one of the first to demand that whole productions, not just individual scenes, undergo lengthy rehearsals. He created cohesive artistic visions for his productions by coordinating staging, costumes, and scenery. In order to create atmospheric illumination that increased the emotional impact of scenes, he even experimented with stage lighting effects, using reflective surfaces and hidden lamps. With periodicals like The Spectator and The Tatler reviewing plays and discussing aesthetics, the 18th century also witnessed the emergence of what is now known as theatre criticism. This led to a more self-conscious theatrical culture, where a more sophisticated audience examined and discussed artistic decisions. The development of theatrical celebrity culture as we know it today began in the late 18th century. Performers such as Sarah Siddons rose to fame in Britain and Europe, their private lives the focus of public interest, and their creative interpretations of important roles discussed with the same fervour that contemporary audiences reserve for athletes. People travelled hundreds of miles to see Siddons' Lady Macbeth perform the sleepwalking scene because she was so well known. Her departure from the stage was viewed as a loss to the nation's culture, and her performance of the part became the benchmark by which all other actresses were judged. She was the first actress to receive a statue in Westminster Abbey, something that would have been unimaginable for a performer only a century before. The development of theatre was impacted by this celebrity culture in both positive and negative ways. On the plus side, well-known actors could ensure that shows have audiences and draw funding to theatre businesses. Their notoriety contributed to the development of theatre as a legitimate art form deserving of significant cultural consideration. On the downside, the star system started to skew theatrical production, with plays selected more for their ability to showcase specific actors than for their inherent artistic value. This resulted in a custom of star vehicles that prioritized individual skills over balanced dramatic construction and ensemble acting. Everything, including theatre, was altered by the Industrial Revolution in ways that continue to shape our perceptions of live performances. Theatre was transformed from an afternoon amusement to an evening event that could rival other nightlife activities, thanks to advancements in lighting technology that allowed indoor performances to last well into the evening. When gas lighting was first used in the early 1800s, it completely changed the possibilities for theatre. For the first time, stage lighting could be precisely adjusted to be brightened for dramatic climaxes and dimmed for intimate scenes. More complex atmospheric effects were made possible, and filmmakers were equipped with new means of directing viewers' attention and evoking strong feelings. By putting performers in the limelight and enabling the type of dramatic illumination that could isolate individual characters or produce amazing visual effects, limelight, which is made by heating lime with oxygen and hydrogen flames, was introduced, resulting in the first powerful spotlight effects. Actors would literally position themselves to catch the most flattering light during this time, which is where the well-known expression "stealing the spotlight" originates. As urban populations increased and the middle class grew, theatres had to expand to accommodate their leisure time and entertainment budget. Several thousand people could fit in some of the theatres constructed during this time, necessitating innovative staging and performance techniques that could successfully project to such sizable crowds. Melodrama, a theatrical genre that focused on stark moral contrasts, breathtaking special effects, and poignant scenarios that were understandable and enjoyable even in large theatres, was born as a result. The plots of melodramas included enough physical action and visual spectacle to keep audiences interested even when they couldn't hear every word of dialogue, while the heroes were entirely good and the villains were completely evil. Melodramatic plots were thrilling for audiences of the time, but delightfully absurd by today's standards. On family farms, villains threatened foreclosure, heroes swung on ropes across burning buildings, heroines were tied to railroad tracks, and evil was always severely punished, usually in a spectacular way, while virtue was always rewarded. However, melodrama fulfilled significant social roles that went beyond simple amusement. In order to help viewers comprehend the swift changes taking place in their society, a number of melodramas addressed modern social issues such as urbanization, class conflict, industrialization, and shifting family structures. The most well-known American play of the 19th century, Uncle Tom's Cabin, employed melodramatic devices to make anti-slavery points to audiences that political speeches and newspaper editorials might not have been able to reach. Additionally, touring productions that could reach audiences in smaller cities and towns gained popularity in the 19th century. As railroad networks expanded, it became financially viable to transport entire productions, complete with sets, costumes, and entire acting companies, to locations across the nation. This made it possible for audiences in far-flung places to see the same plays that were performed in large cities, establishing the first genuinely national theatrical culture. With theatrical syndicates planning tours, reserving venues, and standardizing production values across several locations, theatre emerged as a significant industry during this time. The majority of America's major theatres were under the control of the Theatrical Syndicate, which was established in 1896. Their booking choices had the power to make or ruin careers, a parallel movement that would transform dramatic literature and lay the foundation for many of the tenets that still govern serious theatre today, was emerging at the same time that popular theatre was embracing spectacle and wide emotional appeal. Henrik Ibsen, August Strindberg, and Anton Chekhov were among the first playwrights to tackle contemporary social issues through the experiences of likable characters in familiar settings. Because it addressed marriage and women's rights honestly and in ways that went against ingrained social norms, Ibsen's A Doll's House sparked scandals across Europe. Some theatres refused to present the play's contentious ending, in which Nora abandons her husband and kids to find her own identity, without including a more traditional conclusion in which she resumes her responsibilities to her family. But the controversy was precisely the point. Ibsen and his peers felt that theatre should provoke viewers to reflect deeply on moral issues and societal issues, in addition to providing amusement. This marked a return to theatre's long-standing role as a platform for discussing significant topics. but with a particularly contemporary emphasis on psychological realism and current social issues. Chekhov mastered the art of naturalistic drama by crafting plays in which characters discuss significant topics without directly addressing them, in which the most poignant emotional moments frequently occur in silence, and in which the overall impact relies on minute details rather than dramatic climaxes. Although The Cherry Orchard is supposedly about an aristocratic family losing their estate, it's really about how hard it is to adjust to social change, and how impossible it is to cling to the past. These playwrights developed new techniques for creating psychological depth and emotional authenticity that would influence theatrical writing for the next century and beyond. Their plots centered on internal conflicts and slow revelations rather than external action and dramatic confrontations, and their characters spoke and acted more like real people than theatrical archetypes. More changes to theatre occurred in the 20th century than in any other because of 2 world wars, the emergence of television and film, shifting social mores, and new technological advancements. As naturalistic acting techniques gained popularity in the early part of the century, actors attempted to act as naturally as possible on stage. The more clamorous presentational style that had dominated theatre for centuries was drastically different from this. By using their own emotional experiences and creating intricate psychological backstories for their characters, Konstantin Stanislavski created methodical techniques to assist actors in creating believable characters. Modern actor training was built on the interpretation and modification of the Stanislavski method by American instructors such as Lee Strasberg, Stella Adler, and Sanford Meisner. The notion that actors should live truthfully under imaginary circumstances transformed performance and created guidelines that are still studied and used by the majority of actors today. Meanwhile, experimental theatre artists were pushing in completely different directions, rejecting naturalistic representation entirely in favour of more abstract, symbolic, or ritualistic forms of performance. In Russia, Vsevolod Meyerhold created biomechanical acting methods that prioritise stylized movement and physical accuracy over psychological realism. The theatre of cruelty that Antonin Artaud envisioned would directly affect audiences' emotions and spirituality, while challenging their rational defences through powerful sensory experiences. Despite his own production's frequent failures with modern audiences, his theories shaped experimental theatre for decades. In order to keep audiences from getting emotionally engrossed in theatrical illusion, Bertolt Brecht created epic theatre techniques. In order for the audience to critically consider the social and political issues his plays addressed, he wanted them to keep a critical distance from the action. Political theatre all across the world was impacted by Brecht's alienation effects, which included direct address to the audience, songs that made commentary on the action, and staging that purposefully exposed theatrical artifice. American theatre was creating its own unique traits and contributions to the art form. While European theatre was battling modernist innovations and political upheavals, the rise of uniquely American dramatic voices that wrote about uniquely American issues and experiences occurred in the early 20th century. The first American playwright to receive widespread acclaim for his serious dramatic works was Eugene O'Neill. His early plays featured working-class characters and industrial settings that, in ways never before seen on stage, reflected the realities of American life. Later pieces like The Iceman Cometh and Long Day's Journey into Night examine personal failure and family dysfunction with a psychological depth that was comparable to anything being written in Europe. O'Neill experimented with theatrical methods that went beyond what was typically expected of theatrical entertainment in the United States. In Strange Interlude, there were lengthy aside passages where characters expressed their thoughts out loud. Masks were employed by the great god Brown to symbolize various facets of his persona. By adapting Greek tragedy to an American setting during the Civil War, Morning Becomes Electra produced a trilogy that used classical dramatic structures to analyze American history. The only time in American history that the federal government directly subsidized theatrical production was during the Federal Theatre Project, which was a component of the New Deal initiatives during the Great Depression. Thousands of theatre professionals were employed by the project between 1935 and 1939, and hundreds of productions were produced nationwide, including the groundbreaking living newspaper productions that dramatized current events and social concerns. Even though the Federal Theatre Project was eventually shut down because of political concerns about its left-leaning content, it showed that serious, socially engaged theatre was in high demand across the nation, not just in large cities. The creation of the integrated musical, which fused songs, dances, and dramatic scenes into cohesive artistic experiences, rather than merely entertainment reviews with well-known performers, was perhaps American theatre's most notable contribution to world drama, with songs that developed organically from the character and circumstance rather than being added as specialty numbers. Showboat, 1927, is frequently regarded as the first fully integrated American musical. The production addressed weighty topics like racial prejudice and the passing of time, demonstrating that musical theatre could tackle important issues while still offering mainstream entertainment. All right. 1943 transformed musical theatre by introducing dance sequences that progressed the plot and revealed character rather than merely offering spectacle, and by starting with a single character singing alone on stage instead of a large chorus number. Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein, the second's partnership, created a model for musical theatre design that shaped the genre for many years, through complex music and choreography that produced theatrical experiences unmatched in any other medium. West Side Story, 1957, showed that musical theatre could address modern social issues like gang violence, racial tension, and urban poverty. Classical, jazz, and popular music were all incorporated into Leonard Bernstein's score, and Jerome Robbins' choreography turned dance from a decorative element to a crucial part of the narrative. Broadway musicals' heyday, which spanned roughly the 1940s to the 1960s, produced works that shaped American culture. Songs from these shows entered the popular repertoire, and the shows themselves established Broadway as a major cultural export that influenced musical theatre development worldwide. Alternative theatres arose to accommodate more experimental work and give up-and-coming artists a platform as Broadway grew more commercial and costly. Originally characterised by their smaller size and cheaper ticket costs, off-Broadway theatres evolved into hubs for theatrical innovation and platforms for works that were unable to find a home in commercial settings. Julian Beck and Judith Malina founded the Living Theatre, which pioneered confrontational and interactive theatre that dismantled the conventional divide between audiences and performers. In addition to challenging preconceived notions about social norms and theatrical behaviour, their production of Paradise Now invited audience members to participate in the performance. Instead of adhering to conventional hierarchical structures, the Open Theatre, under the direction of Joseph Chaikin, developed ensemble-based creation techniques in which actors, directors, and writers work together throughout the creative process. Their work, which placed a strong emphasis on vocal and physical experimentation, produced performance styles that had an international impact on experimental theatre and actor training. As a separate field, performance art rejected many of the conventions of theatre, while drawing inspiration from it. Solo performances by artists like Laurie Anderson, Spalding Gray, and Karen Finley blended storytelling, visual art, music, and theatre in ways that defied easy classification as art. A decentralized theatrical culture was produced by the founding of regional theatre companies across the United States in the 1960s and 1970s, which lessened New York's hegemony and offered chances for theatrical growth outside of conventional commercial hubs. Organizations such as the Arena Stage in Washington, D.C., the American Conservatory Theatre in San Francisco, and the Guthrie Theatre in Minneapolis formed unique creative personalities while giving back to their communities. Regional theatres emerged as crucial venues for creating original works and bringing classic plays back to life for modern audiences. In addition to creating audiences for serious theatre in communities across the nation, they offered jobs to theatre professionals who wished to work regularly without vying for the few Broadway openings. The growth of playwright development programs, which supported up-and-coming authors through workshops, readings, and developmental productions, was also encouraged by the regional theatre movement. The works of many of the most significant American playwrights of the late 20th century, such as David Mamet, Sam Shepard, and Lanford Wilson, were developed in regional theatres. The theatre of today is part of a complex ecosystem that also includes social media, video games, streaming services, television, and movies. Instead of being supplanted by these more recent entertainment mediums, theatre has managed to integrate their innovations while preserving its fundamental qualities as a live social event. Diversity is embraced by modern theatre in ways that were unthinkable in earlier times. On contemporary stages, stories from various cultures, previously marginalised viewpoints, and experimental forms that defy conventional notions of what theatre can be coexist. Playwrights such as Tony Kushner, Lin-Manuel Miranda, and Susan Laurie Parks have produced plays that broaden the theatrical canon while appealing to new audiences. The fundamental components of theatrical performance have been improved by technology rather than replaced. Nowadays, sound design is a highly developed art form that produces aural landscapes that were not possible in the past. Computer-controlled systems are used in lighting design to produce effects that are only constrained by the designer's creativity. Real-time visual environments that adapt to live performances are made possible by digital effects and video projection. However, these technological advancements support conventional theatrical functions, such as narrating stories, setting the mood, and drawing in viewers. Realizing that theatre's power is in the direct interaction between actors and audiences, the most successful modern productions use technology to complement live performance rather than to replace it. Some elements of theatre have stayed remarkably consistent over thousands of years, despite all these changes. The fundamental bond between an entertainer and their audience, the enchantment of live performances, and the potency of group storytelling have withstood all social changes and technological advancements. Being in the same room as live performers, experiencing the energy of the crowd, and realizing that this specific performance will never be precisely duplicated are still incomparable. Live performances are unpredictable and crucial in ways that recorded entertainment can never match. With subtle variations brought about by the audience's mood, the performer's energy, the weather, and countless other small factors. Our cave-dwelling ancestors gathered around their fires for many of the same purposes that theatre still fulfills today. It gives difficult feelings and complicated concepts a tangible form and a common context, which aids in their processing. By offering experiences that people can talk about, debate, and remember together, it fosters a sense of community. It allows each generation to reinterpret stories and cultural values for their current relevance while preserving them. Theatre gives us the opportunity to investigate various viewpoints and options in a secure setting where we can experience repercussions without actually going through them, observe other people's decisions, and consider how we might act in comparable situations. Through the experiences of characters who represent various facets of human nature, it offers a forum for discussing ethical issues, societal issues, and interpersonal conflicts. Indeed, theatre serves many important artistic and social purposes, but it's also important to remember that it's just for fun. These small pleasures, the shared gasp of surprise at an unexpected plot twist, the laughter that breaks out during a well-timed comedy sequence, the shared intake of breath during a moment of transcendent beauty, directly connect us to every audience that has ever assembled to witness other people posing as someone else. Theatre's humanity is what makes it so appealing. In contrast to television or movies which show us still photos of actors who played their parts weeks or months ago, theatre shows us real people performing live, right in front of us. The tears shed by a theatre performer are genuine. When they laugh, it's real laughter. They must immediately correct their mistakes in front of the audience. No other art form can compare to the sense of danger and urgency this evokes. During a live performance, anything can happen. An actor may forget their lines, a set piece may break, or a costume may tear at a pivotal point. How the actors respond to these situations becomes part of the entertainment for the evening. By agreeing to overlook small errors and recognizing the skill needed to produce convincing characters and gripping narratives under such immediate pressure, the audience complicitly maintains the theatrical illusion. With theatrical traditions from all over the world influencing one another in ways that were not feasible in the past, modern theatre has a genuinely global reach. Western experimental theatre is influenced by Japanese no and kabuki techniques. Modern American playwriting is influenced by African storytelling traditions. Asian productions of Western classics adopt European directing techniques. By broadening the scope of methods, themes, and approaches accessible to modern artists, this cross-pollination has enhanced theatre. As artists strive to respect traditional forms while bringing them up to date for contemporary audiences, as well as negotiate issues of cultural appropriation and genuine representation, it has also brought forth new difficulties. Theatre innovations are now widely disseminated across national and cultural borders through the festival circuit. Festivals in Adelaide, Edinburgh, Avignon, and numerous other cities offer venues for artists from various traditions to exchange their work and have an impact on one another's growth. This international exchange has been sped up by digital communication, which has made it possible for theatre professionals to collaborate on projects, share techniques, and reach audiences around the world in ways that were unthinkable for earlier generations. Although live streaming of theatrical performances has grown in sophistication and popularity, it still serves as an addition to live theatre experiences rather than as a substitute for them. Theatre keeps changing while retaining its fundamental qualities as we look to the future. Although they haven't yet completely altered the fundamental theatrical experience of live performers working with live audiences, Virtual and augmented reality technologies present new opportunities for staging and audience interaction. Theatre operations are being impacted by environmental concerns, as many businesses are implementing sustainable set construction, energy use, and touring logistics practices. As audiences, funding sources, and distribution strategies shift in response to more general social and technological advancements, theatre's economics continue to change. The same urgent subject matter that has always inspired the most compelling dramatic work is available to theatre today in the form of climate change, political polarisation, economic inequality, and technological disruption. Emerging playwrights of today are figuring out how to deal with these issues while respecting theatre's historical advantages and investigating fresh avenues for artistic expression. Tens of thousands of years ago, the first storytellers gathered around their fires and began a tradition that today's young performers are carrying on. They're learning from teachers who learned from teachers who can trace their ancestry back through centuries of theatrical tradition, an unbroken line of knowledge and technique that links actors of today to actors of the past. However, they're also developing new formats and inventive storytelling techniques that appeal to audiences in the modern era who are confronted with previously unheard of possibilities and challenges. They are performing for audiences that include people from all over the world, working in theatres that are equipped with new technology, and tackling artistic and social issues that were unthinkable for earlier generations. Theatre adapts without losing its core, which is why it endures and flourishes. While embracing new technologies, it keeps its emphasis on interpersonal connections and in-person communication. It explores the timeless themes that have always fueled dramatic literature while incorporating shifting social perspectives. In addition to developing new narratives that represent modern experience, it discovers novel ways to tell old tales. The value of theatre's emphasis on community, presence, and shared experience increases rather than decreases in our increasingly digital, remote, and fast-paced world. The experience of sitting in a theatre with hundreds of other people, all of whom are focused on the same live performance, feels more valuable and unique as more of our entertainment becomes personalised and customisable. Theatre serves as a reminder that humans are social beings who require opportunities to come together in physical settings where we can laugh, cry, and discuss what it means to be human. It offers a break from the never-ending stimulation of digital media in favour of the more profound rewards of focused attention, emotional involvement, and group contemplation. For the next few hours, you become a part of something bigger than yourself, part of the ongoing dialogue between the past and present, between artists and audiences, and between personal experience and collective understanding that has been going on for as long as people have been gathering to tell stories. This begins when the curtain rises and the first actor enters the spotlight. You take part in one of the oldest and most enduring traditions in human history in that dimly lit theatre, with strangers who momentarily become your companions as you watch a story unfold. Together with everyone else present, you consent to believe the story being told and allow yourself to be moved by the experiences of fictional characters who are portrayed by actual people just a few feet away from you. And when the lights come up and the applause subsides, you take a little bit of that experience back into your everyday life, memories of things that shocked, touched, or challenged you. Questions prompted by the story you've seen, connections drawn between the experiences of the characters and your own life, and the pure joy of spending time with people who have chosen to congregate in that specific location at that specific moment to partake in the age-old enchantment of live performance. Because it fulfills needs that technology cannot and offers experiences that no other art form can match, theatre has endured. There will always be theatres where actors and audiences gather to discuss what it means to be alive in any given time and location, as long as people have a need for stories, a desire for connection, and a search for meaning in shared experiences. So let's celebrate theatre, its absurd aspirations and deep fulfillments, its age-old wisdom and modern inventions, and its capacity to make us laugh, cry, and think, often all in one evening. Cheers to the actors who dedicate their lives to playing different roles, the directors who transform unfinished material into meaningful experiences, the designers who build worlds out of plywood and imagination, and the audiences who consistently turn up night after night, willing to believe whatever story is being told. The custom is upheld, the curtain is raised, and the never-ending dialogue between the performer and the audience, the story and the listener, and the imagination and the real world continues. May your own performances, whether on stage or in the everyday theatre of life, be full of the ideal ratio of humour and drama, knowledge and awe and individual expression and group harmony. Sweet dreams. You wake up before dawn in your cell, not because you want to, but because Marcus, the lanista who runs this gladiator school, has a peculiar fondness for roosters, 3 of them to be exact, and they seem to take personal offence at the concept of sleep. Their crowing echoes through the stone corridors of the ludus like a cacophony of very angry, very small trumpets. Your sleeping mat isn't exactly what you'd call comfortable. It's essentially a thin piece of fabric stretched over straw that's seen better decades. But you've grown accustomed to it, the way you've grown accustomed to most things in this life that chose you rather than the other way around. The cell is small, about the size of a modern walk-in closet, with walls that weep moisture in the winter and radiate heat like an oven in summer. You stretch, feeling your joints pop in that satisfying way that reminds you you're still alive and relatively intact. This is always a good sign in your line of work. Your body's a roadmap of small scars and faded bruises, each one a story you'd rather not tell at dinner parties, if you went to dinner parties, which you don't. The other gladiators are stirring too. There's Gaius, who snores like a hibernating bear and somehow always looks surprised when he wakes up, as if sleep were a magic trick he couldn't quite figure out. Across the corridor, you can hear Lucius already doing his morning stretches. The man is unnaturally disciplined, the sort who probably organised his toys by colour as a child. The guards unlock the cells with a series of metallic clanks that serve as your daily alarm clock. You file out with the others, a procession of dishevelled warriors shuffling toward the communal washing area. The water is cold enough to make you question your life choices, but it does the job of shocking you fully awake. Breakfast is barley porridge with a consistency somewhere between soup and mortar. Sometimes there are bits of dried meat floating in it, though you've learned not to ask too many questions about the sauce. The bread is dense and chewy, the kind that doubles as a weapon if you're creative enough, but it fills your stomach, and in this business, that's really all you can ask for. You eat in relative silence, listening to the morning sounds of the ludus coming to life. Somewhere, a blacksmith is already working on equipment repairs, the rhythmic hammering that will provide the soundtrack to your day. The cook is arguing with a grain merchant about quality, their voices carrying across the courtyard in rapid-fire Etruscan that sounds like an argument between 2 very passionate birds. After breakfast, you report to the equipment room, where Titus, the grizzled old gladiator who survived long enough to become an instructor, inspects each fighter's gear with the intensity of a mother examining her child's scraped knee. Your leather armour gets a thorough once-over, straps checked, padding adjusted. Your sword, a gladius that's seen more action than a diplomat in wartime, is examined for nicks and wear. Your shield grip is loose, Titus mutters, his weathered hands working the leather strapping. Loose grip, loose life. Remember that. You nod, though you've heard this particular wisdom roughly 300 times. Titus has maybe a dozen sayings that he rotates through like a philosophical water wheel, but the man has survived 15 years in the arena, so you listen. In your world, survival tips come from people who've actually survived, not from people who've read about surviving. The morning inspection complete, you head to the training grounds. The sand is already warm under your feet, heated by the early sun filtering through the ludus's open roof. Today will be another day of practice, preparation, and trying not to think too hard about why you're preparing. The training ground is your second home, though calling it home might be generous. It's more like that relative's house where you have to stay sometimes. Familiar but not exactly comfortable. The sand is fine and white, imported from some distant beach where people probably have better career options than professional combat. Your first drill of the day is footwork, which sounds simple until you realise that in the arena, fancy footwork is the difference between going home to your cell and going home to whatever afterlife the gods have planned for you. You practice the basic movements: advance, retreat, pivot, and dodge. Each step has to be precise. Each movement is economic. Wasted motion is wasted energy, and wasted energy is how you end up as entertainment for the crowd in ways you didn't intend. Titus watches from the sidelines, occasionally barking corrections. "You're dancing, not fighting. This isn't a festival." His voice carries the authority of someone who's seen too many promising gladiators make simple mistakes with permanent consequences. You adjust your stance, lower your centre of gravity, and try to look less like you're performing a religious ceremony and more like you're preparing for controlled violence. The wooden practice sword feels different from your real blade, lighter but somehow more awkward. It feels akin to attempting to write with a stick after becoming accustomed to a proper stylus. But the wooden sword won't accidentally remove important parts of your training partners, which everyone appreciates. Gaius is your sparring partner today, which is both good news and bad news. Good news? He's reliable and won't try anything unnecessarily creative that might result in an unplanned trip to the medical tent. Bad news? He has the subtlety of a falling tree and hits about as hard as one. Your arms are going to feel like overcooked noodles by the end of this session. You circle each other in the sand, shields up, wooden swords ready. The morning sun is climbing higher, and you can already feel sweat beginning to gather under your leather armour. Gaius makes the first move, a straightforward attack that you see coming from roughly the next province over. You parry, riposte, and dance backward as he follows up with a shield bash that would have rearranged your face if it had connected. Better, Titus calls out, but you're still thinking too much. Trust your training. Trust your training. This is one of his most cherished sayings. While it may seem simple to utter, it becomes more challenging to execute when faced with a formidable opponent, even during training sessions. But you know what he means. The hours of repetition, the muscle memory built up through countless drills, it's all designed to work automatically when your conscious mind is busy with other things, like staying alive. The sparring continues for what feels like hours, but is probably only 30 minutes. You and Gaius work through various scenarios, attacks from different angles, combinations of sword and shield work, and defense against multiple opponents. By the end, the sand has managed to find its way into places it shouldn't be, and you're both breathing heavily. Next comes strength training, which in your world means lifting heavy things and carrying them around until your muscles remember who's in charge. There are stone weights, water-filled amphorae, and a particularly unpleasant exercise involving carrying your training partner across the sand while he tries to make your life difficult by refusing to cooperate. It's like moving furniture if furniture were actively trying to make you drop it. The afternoon brings weapons training with different types of equipment. Today it's net and trident work, which requires a completely different skill set from sword and shield. The net is deceptively tricky. It looks simple until you try to throw it with any accuracy while someone is actively trying to avoid being caught. It's like trying to catch a fish with a blanket while the fish is running away from you. The trident is heavy and awkward at first, but there's something satisfying about its reach and power. It's a weapon that demands respect, both from you and from anyone facing it. The 3 prongs make it excellent for defense, and the length gives you options that a shorter weapon doesn't provide. As the day's training winds down, you clean your equipment and store it properly. In the gladiator business, taking care of your gear isn't just good practice, it's a survival strategy. A rusty sword or a cracked shield can turn a manageable fight into a brief career change. Life in the Ludus isn't just about fighting. It's about mastering the complicated social dynamics of a place where everyone's job involves potential violence. But somehow you all have to live together between the violent bits. It's like being in a very specialised boarding school where detention might involve permanent injury. You've learned to read the moods and personalities of your fellow gladiators, the way a sailor reads weather patterns. There's Quintus, who gets moody before fights and has a tendency to pick arguments about nothing. Smart money says to give him extra space when he starts complaining about the food, the weather, or the particular way someone else breathes. Felix goes silent before a match, as if saving his words for a future conversation he may not live to have. The gladiator hierarchy is unspoken but clearly understood by everyone. Veterans like Titus occupy the top tier. They've survived long enough to earn respect, and, more importantly, they've survived long enough to teach others how to survive. Below them are the established fighters who've proven themselves in the arena but haven't yet achieved legendary status. Then there are the newer gladiators, like yourself, who are still figuring out whether this career path was a choice or something that happened to them. At the bottom are the newcomers, the ones who maintain a confused expression, as if they're unsure of their journey to this place. You remember having that look. Everyone does. It usually fades after the first few training sessions, replaced by a more practical expression that says, "Well, this is happening, so I might as well get good at it." Marcus, the Lanista, is a businessman first and a patron of the arts second, if you consider gladiatorial combat an art form. He consistently expresses his thoughts. He expresses his opinions both loudly and frequently. He has opinions about fighting styles the way other people have opinions about wine or poetry. He'll spend 20 minutes explaining why a particular shield technique is aesthetically superior to another, while you stand there thinking about lunch and trying to look interested. But Marcus isn't cruel, just practical. Marcus views his gladiators as an investment that requires maintenance. The food is adequate, the medical care is surprisingly excellent, and he doesn't work anyone to the point of being useless. He's learned that half-dead gladiators put on disappointing shows, and disappointing shows are bad for business. The Ludus doctor, a Greek named Demetrius, treats injuries with the efficiency of someone who's seen every possible way the human body can be damaged in combat. He's patched up everything from minor cuts to major sword wounds, and he does it all with the bedside manner of a particularly unsentimental accountant. Don't die is his most common medical advice, delivered in the same tone someone might use to remind you to close a door behind you. Meals serve as communal affairs, combining informal strategy sessions, gossip exchanges, and group therapy. You learn which fighters are struggling with upcoming matches, who's been having nightmares, and whose family sent a letter from home. The conversations flow in a mixture of Latin, Etruscan, and the occasional borrowed phrase from whatever distant province someone originally called home. Today's dinner conversation centres around rumours of a new type of gladiator being trained in Rome. Fighters who specialise in some exotic weapon combination that sounds both impressive and impractical. Everyone has theories about what this development means for the profession, but most of those theories include complaints about young gladiators today and how things were better in the past. In my time, says Cassius, who's been having his time for about 3 years now, gladiators learned proper fundamentals, none of this fancy showmanship. He waves his bread dramatically, as if it were partially responsible for the decline of gladiatorial standards. You listen with half an ear while working on your dinner, which tonight includes what might be chicken, or rabbit, or possibly something else entirely that's been seasoned aggressively enough to make identification unnecessary. The meat is tender, whatever it is, and that's really what matters. After dinner, there's a brief period of spare time before lights out. Some gladiators spend this time writing letters to family. Others practice simple crafts like leatherworking or wood carving. A few gather around whoever has the best voice for storytelling, listening to tales of famous battles, legendary gladiators, or occasionally just funny stories about things that happened in other cities. The summons arrives on a Tuesday, which somehow worsens it. Tuesdays are supposed to be for routine training and equipment maintenance, not for life-altering announcements. But there's Marcus, standing in the courtyard with that particular expression that means someone's about to have their schedule dramatically rearranged. "We have a match," he announces, consulting a wax tablet covered in what looks like notes, written by someone with either terrible handwriting or very shaky hands. Local magistrate is hosting games for his son's coming of age, 3 days from now. You experience that peculiar dropping sensation in your stomach, similar to the feeling of stepping off a cliff in the dark. 3 days. That's enough time to worry about it, but not enough time to do anything productive with the worrying. It's akin to receiving an invitation to a dinner party, only to discover that the guests are plotting your death for amusement. The match details are straightforward enough. You'll be fighting against a gladiator from a rival school in the next town over. The match will involve standard sword and shield combat, with the winner being the first to surrender, or more accurately, the first to lose the ability to surrender. The crowd will be relatively small, maybe 200 people, but that's still 200 people who will be watching you try to stay alive while someone else tries to prevent that from happening. Marcus reads off a few more details. The time of day, afternoon, which is good because the light will be consistent, the expected duration, however long it takes, and the prize money, which will be divided between the school and the gladiator, assuming the gladiator is in a position to spend money afterward. After the announcement, the other gladiators offer the usual mixture of encouragement and practical advice. "Remember to keep your shield up," says Lucius, as if you might forget this crucial detail. "Don't let him get inside your guard," adds Gaius, which is also helpful in the way that try not to get hit is beneficial. But their concern is genuine, even if their advice is obvious. In the gladiator business, everyone understands that each fight could be someone's last, and that knowledge creates a particular kind of camaraderie. You're all in the same boat, even if you're taking turns rowing while the others bail water. The next 3 days pass in a blur of intensified training and mental preparation. Titus works with you on specific techniques, drilling combinations until they become automatic. Muscle memory, he keeps saying. When your brain is busy trying not to panic, your muscles need to know what to do without instruction. You practice against different opponents, each with their fighting style, trying to prepare for whatever approach your actual opponent might use. Will he be aggressive and try to overwhelm you quickly? Defensive and patient, waiting for you to make a mistake? He may be tricky and unpredictable, varying his tactics to keep you on your toes. There's no way to know until you're actually facing him in the sand. The night before the fight, sleep fluctuates. You think about all the things that could go wrong, then try not to think about them, but that makes you think about them more. It's like trying not to think about elephants. The harder you try, the more elephants show up in your mental landscape. Eventually, you give up on sleep and spend the pre-dawn hours in quiet meditation, going through the fight mentally, visualizing different scenarios and your responses to them. This is another thing Titus taught you. Fight the battle in your head first. Work out the problems when the stakes are imaginary. Dawn arrives with its usual lack of consideration for whether you're ready for it or not. Today is the day. Your breakfast tastes like sand, though that might be because there's actual sand in it. The morning bread sometimes picks up unexpected ingredients from the baker's workspace, or it might be because your mouth is dry with anticipation. You check your equipment one final time. Sword, sharp and balanced. Shield, solid and properly gripped. Armour, fitted and secure. Everything is as ready as it can be. Now it's just a matter of getting yourself to the same state of readiness. The arena is smaller than you expected, but somehow that makes it more intimate and therefore more nerve-wracking. It's like being invited to perform in someone's living room, except the performance involves mortal combat, and the living room is filled with people who've paid to watch you possibly die. The crowd is already gathering as you arrive, and you can hear the buzz of conversation and anticipation. There's something about the sound of a crowd that's both energizing and terrifying, all those voices blending together into a collective murmur of expectation. They're here to see a show, and you're one of the main attractions, whether you feel ready for the spotlight or not. Your opponent is already in the preparation area when you arrive. He's about your height but broader through the shoulders, with the kind of build that suggests he's been doing his job for a while. His equipment looks well maintained and professional, always a bad sign when you're hoping for an easy match. He nods politely when he sees you, which is somehow more unsettling than if he'd tried to intimidate you. Polite opponents are often the most dangerous ones. The preparation ritual helps calm your nerves through its very familiarity. You apply oil to your skin to avoid grappling, conduct a final inspection of your weapons, and make necessary adjustments to your armour. Demetrius, the Ludus doctor, gives you a quick physical examination, checking your joints, your reflexes, and your general state of not yet being injured. Try to stay that way, he advises, which is both helpful and obvious. Marcus appears for a final consultation, offering last-minute strategy advice and reminders about things you've known for months. But his presence is reassuring in the way that having a familiar face around is always reassuring when you're about to do something that might end badly. Remember, he says, the crowd wants a fantastic show, but they also want to see skill. Don't just survive. Demonstrate your training. Make it clear that you belong in there. The waiting is the worst part. You can hear the preliminary events happening in the arena. Animal hunts, minor exhibitions, and warm-up acts that get the crowd interested and ready for the main events. Each cheer from the audience marks another step closer to your turn in the sand. Finally, it's time. The arena official comes to collect you, and you walk through the tunnel that leads from the preparation area to the fighting ground. The tunnel is cool and shadowy, a brief respite before you emerge into the bright sunlight and the noise of the crowd. The arena floor is pristine white sand, raked smooth and ready for action. The afternoon sun casts sharp shadows from the arena walls, creating areas of bright light and relative darkness that you'll need to navigate during the fight. The crowd noise hits you like a physical force as you enter. Cheers, calls, conversations, and the rustling of fabric as people shift in their seats. You and your opponent are introduced to the crowd, though the announcer gets your name slightly wrong in a way that makes you sound like you're from a different province entirely. The crowd doesn't seem to mind. The crowd cheers appropriately, assessing both fighters with the experienced eye of those familiar with such events. The magistrate who's hosting the games makes a brief speech about courage, skill, and the noble tradition of gladiatorial combat. He's clearly enjoying his role as patron of the arts, gesturing broadly and speaking with the kind of enthusiasm that comes from not being the one holding a sword. Then comes the final ritual, the salute to the audience, the acknowledgement of the magistrate, and the formal beginning of the combat. Your opponent raises his sword and shield, and you mirror the gesture. The crowd falls relatively quiet, sensing that the real show is about to begin. The referee, an experienced former gladiator himself, checks that both fighters are ready, examines the weapons one last time, and steps back to the edge of the combat area. "Start!" he shouts, and there's no more waiting, preparing, or worrying. Now there's only what is happening. Your opponent moves first, a cautious advance that tells you he's experienced enough not to rush into anything stupid. Such behaviour is both good news and bad news. Good because you won't have to deal with reckless aggression. Bad because it means he knows what he's doing and plans to do it competently. You circle each other in the sand, shields up, swords ready, each trying to read the other's intentions. The crowd noise fades into background static as your attention narrows to focus on the person trying to hurt you in a professional capacity. His footwork is solid, his guard position textbook perfect. The task is going to require actual effort. He tests your defences with a series of quick attacks, nothing committed, just probing strikes to see how you respond. Your parries are automatic, muscle memory taking over as tight as predicted. Despite the artificial nature of the situation, the familiar weight of the sword and shield, the resistance of blade against blade, and the small adjustments of stance and position all feel natural. The first real exchange happens when he commits to an overhead strike that you deflect with your shield, following up with a thrust that he barely avoids. The crowd responds with appreciative noise. They can tell the difference between tentative testing and actual combat. Your opponent steps back, reassessing, and you take the opportunity to do the same. He's favouring his right side slightly, which might indicate an old injury or just a natural tendency. His shield work is defensive but not passive. He's using it to set up his attacks rather than just blocking yours. This tactical thinking is a result of his experience and training. You try a different approach, varying your attack angles and timing to keep him guessing. You execute a low cut, a high thrust, and a shield bash, compelling him to concede. He responds with a combination that nearly gets through your guard, the tip of his blade passing close enough to your ribs to remind you that the battle isn't a training exercise. The fight develops a rhythm. Advance, attack, defend, reassess, repeat. Both of you are breathing harder now, sweat making your grip slippery despite the leather wrapping on your sword handle. The sand shifts under your feet, creating small challenges in footing that add another layer of complexity to the combat. Minutes pass, though they feel like hours. Now the crowd engages, applauding particularly skillful moves from either fighter. You hear voices giving contradictory and unhelpful advice. Your opponent tries a new strategy, pressing his attack more aggressively, trying to overwhelm your defences through sheer persistence. It's a dangerous game. Aggressive attacks create opportunities for your opponent, but they also create opportunities for you. You weather his initial assault, then counter with a combination that drives him back toward the arena wall. Cornering an opponent is advantageous, but also dangerous. Desperate fighters do unpredictable things, and predictability is one of the few allies you have in this business. He proves the point by attempting a move that's either brilliant or suicidal, a spinning attack that would either take your head off or leave him completely exposed. It turns out to be more suicidal than brilliant. You deftly sidestep the attack, delivering a powerful thrust that pierces his guard and hits his sword arm. It's not enough to disable him, but it's enough to slow him down and signal to both of you that the fight has escalated to a new level of seriousness. He backs away, shaking his arm to restore feeling, and reassesses his situation. You can see him thinking, calculating odds, and considering his options. The crowd can sense the shift in momentum too. Their noise level increases as they anticipate a resolution. But experienced gladiators don't give up easily, and your opponent is nothing if not experienced. He adjusts his grip to compensate for his injured arm, and settles into a more defensive stance, making you come to him rather than continuing his aggressive approach. The final phase of the fight is a careful dance of patience and opportunity. Your opponent, nursing his injured arm, has become more cautious, but also more dangerous, in the same way that cornered animals become more dangerous. He now has nothing to lose, which makes him unpredictable in precisely the way you were hoping to avoid. You press your advantage carefully, not wanting to rush into a trap, but also not wanting to let him recover fully. The crowd senses the approaching climax, and their voices rise accordingly. Someone is shouting what sounds like betting odds, though the numbers are changing faster than you can follow. Your opponent tries one more aggressive combination, putting everything into a series of attacks that would either finish the fight quickly or leave him completely exposed. It's a calculated risk that almost pays off. His first strike gets through your guard and scores a shallow cut across your ribs, drawing blood and reminding you that the fight isn't over until it's over. However, his follow-up attack lags slightly, as his injured arm fails to respond as expected. You parry his thrust and counter with a move Titus drilled into you so many times you could do it while sleeping. A shield bash to create distance, followed immediately by a thrust that gets past his guard and finds the gap between his armor plates. The point of your sword comes to rest against his chest, just above his heart. It's not profound enough to inflict significant harm, yet your placement is accurate enough to indicate that his next move could prove lethal if he persists in fighting. For a moment, everything stops. The crowd noise fades to near silence as everyone waits to see what happens next. Your opponent looks down at the sword point, then backs up to your eyes and makes his decision. "I yield," he says, loud enough for the referee and the crowd to hear clearly. The crowd cheers for your win and the fight's quality. This is what they came to see. Skill, courage, and a contest decided by ability rather than luck or accident. You step back and lower your sword, acknowledging your opponent's surrender with the respect due to someone who fought well and honourably. The magistrate rises from his seat and renders the official decision, though it was never really in doubt once the yield was declared. The crowd continues to cheer as you and your opponent salute each other in the audience, the formal conclusion to the formal combat. Back in the preparation area, Demetrius examines your cut and declares it superficial enough to heal without complications. Your opponent, whose name you finally learn is Servius, turns out to be a decent person who's been doing his job for about as long as you have. You share a cup of wine and compare notes about fighting techniques, training methods, and the particular challenges of making a living through combat sports. "Good fight," he says, and means it. That last combination was well executed. Your instructor knows his business. You agree, thinking of Titus and his endless drilling of fundamental techniques. "Muscle memory," you say, echoing his favourite phrase. When your brain gets busy, your muscles need to know what to do. The ride back to the Ludus is quiet and comfortable. Marcus is pleased with your performance, not just the victory, but the way you achieved it. "Good technique, good sportsmanship, good entertainment value," he summarises. The magistrate was impressed. The experience could lead to more opportunities. More opportunities. In your business, that's both positive news and something to think carefully about. More opportunities mean more prize money and more recognition, but they also mean more chances for things to go wrong in permanent ways. But that's a concern for tomorrow. Tonight you're back in your familiar cell, with your familiar thin mattress and your familiar view of the stone wall. Your equipment is cleaned and stored, your small wound is bandaged and healing, and you're alive and relatively intact. You fall asleep to the sound of Gaius snoring and the distant murmur of your fellow gladiators discussing the day's events. Tomorrow will bring more training, more preparation, and eventually more fights. But tonight, you're simply a person who went to work, did their job competently, and came home safely. In the gladiator business, that's the pinnacle of success.